All I have to say is the nation stands in admiration of your constitution, and being in the chair yesterday from bell to bell for 8.5 hours. They're all full of admiration for your personal constitution as well. The statement, I beg to move, Mr. Speaker, that this House has considered Parliament's rights in relation to the approval of military action by British forces overseas. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this debate. My honourable friend, the member for Wirral South, was right yesterday in the debate when she said, in quoting the member for Sutton Coldfield, "This is a hung Parliament, therefore political power must pass from the Cabinet to the floor of the House." I don't totally agree with that analysis. The lack of a majority makes it more urgent, but the principle of accountability to Parliament when it comes to war making was established in 2003 when the Labour Party had a large majority in Parliament, and it's that principle that I believe should now be enshrined into law. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the tombstone of the former Foreign Secretary, our friend the late Robin Cook, who warned so eloquently in the House against the decision to invade Iraq, records his words: "I may not have succeeded in halting the war, but I did secure the right of Parliament to decide on war. The government, I'm sorry to say, is now attempting to overturn that democratic advance." Yes.
Extremely grateful to him for giving way so early. Does the right honourable gentleman not agree that the protection of the lives of UK servicemen and women will sometimes require surprise, and that therefore prior parliamentary approval could on occasions be life-threatening?
I will be dealing with that point during my speech. I do understand the point he's making and the need for urgent action at times, and there are provisions for that in the proposals that we're putting forward. During yesterday's statement, the Father of the House and the Leader of the Scottish National Party, as well as the Leader of the Liberal Democrats, as well as the official opposition, agreed that Parliament should have been recalled. This is actually a common position on all sides of the House, irrespective, absolutely irrespective of our views on the action that was undertaken in Syria last Saturday morning. Yes.
To my right honourable friend, would he agree with me that it's not just voices inside this chamber, but voices outside the great British public that we should listen to as well? A woman on a doorstep in Ealing said to me this weekend, did we just regain sovereignty of Parliament to hand it over to a Prime Minister with no majority? Or worse still, to Trump? Did she not have a point?
I think my honourable friend's constituent is quite right that parliamentary sovereignty does require that Parliament holds government to account. And I quote the Father of the House, who said once President Trump had announced to the world that he was proposing a widespread debate was taking place everywhere, including among many members of Parliament in the media. However, there was no debate in Parliament. It was happening everywhere except here. The SNP leader put it more succinctly. When the Prime Minister called a Cabinet meeting last week, she could and should have recalled Parliament. The UK Prime Minister and the Executive must be accountable to Parliament, not to any other government, let alone the whims of any other President or Head of State. The need for an independent British foreign policy based on human rights and international law has never been more urgent. I'll give way a couple of times, then I'm moving on.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Does he share my disappointment that we have a Prime Minister here who inherited a parliamentary majority, managed to rather clumsily lose it, but rather than responding to that situation by trying to build consensus across the House on a whole raft of things, this being the most important, but on all opposition days and so on, is deciding to respond to her situation by ignoring Parliament rather than trying to build consensus across it?
I thank my friend the member for Chesterfield for that, because he's right that there could have been all kinds of debates taken place and a consensus reached or not, but there could have been that opportunity. That is what Parliament exists for. And parliamentary approval can be of crucial importance to ensure the democratic legitimacy of any planned military operation or warlike act, just as it can establish public consent for the government's wider strategy. Currently, I'll give way one more time. Yes, yourself.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Gentleman giving way. He mentions a vote. Had there been a vote in this place last week to protect innocent civilians in Syria, how would he have voted?
This is a debate about process. And if he could, if the member could just contain his aggression for a moment, I made very clear my concerns about this strike, about the legitimacy behind it and the legality behind it. So I thought it's pretty obvious what my view on it was. That is not to say, as I pointed out last night, the need...
Order. I say to the honourable gentleman from Rayleigh, who made a very fine speech yesterday, that he spoke on his feet and with considerable passion and integrity, but he should not now rant from a sedentary position. He used to misbehave 30 years ago when he stood against me in Conservative student politics. We've both grown up since then. Jeremy Corbyn.
Are we going to get a video? Are we going to get a video of that debate? Currently, Mr. Speaker, the government of the day, whichever the hue, can, under the powers of the royal prerogative, deploy our armed forces without obtaining parliamentary consent for its action. It's also important that our armed forces know they have the democratic backing of Parliament and the support of the public for any action they undertake. Yes, one more time.
I'm grateful, my right honourable friend, and isn't the essential point here that the action that the government's taken actually goes against the statement they made in 2016, because they prayed in aid then, action taken in 2013, 2014 and 2015, the nature of which was essentially similar to the action that was taken last week on the Prime Minister's prerogative. And unless it's clarified and codified in law, the uncertainty will remain as to whether or not the government really respects the convention it says that it still adheres to.
Indeed, my friend is right. There is an established convention which I fear the government has been trying to breach that established convention with their actions yesterday. I welcome the parliamentary convention that's developed since the Iraq War, and the government being expected to seek the approval of the House before committing forces to action. The Prime Minister came to...
Smith, apologies, I must take the point of order. I hope it is a point of order.
Following that intervention, I just want to clarify at the difference between this operation and 2013.
Yes. Order. No, it's not... Well, first of all, the right honourable gentleman should sit down when I'm on my feet. Secondly, in deference to the very great seniority of the right honourable gentleman, I'll hear him if it's a short sentence. Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
In 2013, America and Britain had not gone to the UN and were planning to go to the UN. In this operation, we had been to the UN and it had been vetoed.
Yes. It's an extremely interesting debating point, but if I put it very politely, as a point of order, I'm afraid it would be, in old-fashioned O-level terms, unclassified. Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, the former Prime Minister came to this House to seek authority for military action in Libya in 2011, Syria 2015, and in 2013 sought authorisation for military action in Syria, which the House denied. I'm sorry to say the Prime Minister's decision not to recall Parliament and engage in further military action in Syria last week showed a flagrant disregard for this convention. This was underscored by the Secretary of State for International Development, who said yesterday, and I quote, "Outsourcing that decision to people who do not have the full picture is quite wrong, and I think the convention that was established is very wrong." No, I won't give way at this moment. So it seems the convention established in 2003 and in the Cabinet Manual is being tossed aside as simply being inconvenient. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe it's necessary and urgent that this House has the opportunity to discuss its rights and responsibilities in decisions on UK military intervention. I'm not giving way for the moment, thank you, which is not currently codified by law and which, as we've discovered in recent days, cannot be guaranteed by conventions alone. The Prime Minister's actions are a clear demonstration of why Parliament must assert its authority on this subject. But this is not solely about the actions taken last weekend, though they illustrate the case, or what action the government might seek to take in the coming weeks and months. This is a principle that I know has long-standing support across the House. No matter on what side of this House we sit, we all recognise we're here to represent the interests of the people who have elected and sent us here. This is a parliamentary democracy. The people put us here to take decisions on their behalf. No, I'm not giving way for the moment. Enshrining the right of elected MPs to decide on matters of peace and war is an essential, vital development of hundreds of years of democratic development and parliamentary accountability. In effect, Mr. Speaker, 17 countries have the rights of Parliament to approve military action enshrined in their own laws. And it should escape no one that the general public want to see an increased role of Parliament in the decision-making process around planned military action. One last time.
Thank you. Thank you for giving way. Does he agree with me that it is the role of the government to put the safety of our citizens first, and that the government therefore has to have the power to act in the national interest for security and to act swiftly and confidentially, taking into account our servicemen and our allies' servicemen' safety?
Well, it's perfectly clear from what I'm proposing that Parliament should have the right to hold government to account, and that government should seek prior parliamentary approval before undertaking major military actions. The honourable lady might not agree with me. That is the joy of a parliamentary democracy. Indeed.
Order. I don't know what's happened to the honourable gentleman from North Dorset. Decades ago, when he was at Oxford University as a student, my wife always said to me subsequently he was a very well-behaved young man. He seems to have regressed since then. It's very unsatisfactory. He's got to try to improve his condition. And we can't have people constantly ranting from a sedentary position. And the Leader of the Opposition will be heard. Let's be clear about that, and so will every other speaker. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It should really not escape anyone that the general public actually want to see an increased role for Parliament in decision-making processes around military action. Talk to people on the streets of this country last weekend. Many said, why wasn't Parliament recalled? Why has Parliament not been consulted? We elected people to Parliament to do just that. And we obviously have a diversity of opinion around this chamber. That is what a democracy throws up. But I do believe we have a responsibility to both hold the government to account, and the government has responsibility to come here before it makes those major decisions. Mr. Speaker, I'm making progress, so I won't be giving way anymore. Indeed, a recent Survation poll found that 54% of people thought it was wrong for the Prime Minister to have ordered airstrikes without parliamentary approval. I also, Mr. Speaker, urge members of this House not to forget the duty placed upon us by the Chilcot inquiry. The Chilcot inquiry was the result of the war in Iraq. It was the last of many inquiries held into that process. It was the most thorough and painstaking there had ever been, And I would have thought that is a salutary lesson to all of us on the importance of there being total scrutiny of what goes on and the government being required to come to the House in advance of major decisions. Many of us opposed it, but that isn't the point. The point is whether or not Parliament had the right to have a say in it. And I would urge those members that are trying to intervene on me at the moment to take a break and read a bit of the Chilcot report while I'm finishing my speech. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is important that the House holds the government of the day to account on matters of national and of global security. William Hague, the then Foreign Secretary, stated in the House in 2011, outlined a commitment to enshrine in law for the future the necessity of consulting Parliament on military action. The Cabinet Manual, published in 2011, also confirms the acceptance of that convention. So what we're doing is actually going back on an established position. And that convention guarantees that the government will observe that convention except where there is an emergency and such action would not be appropriate. Therefore, reserving the right for the government to act in a matter of emergency. A War Powers Act could specify at what point in decision-making processes MPs should be involved, as well as retaining the right of ministers to act in an emergency or in the country's self-defence. Yet government policy now seems to have shifted against this process.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He turned in his speech to the question of when such approvals would be required by Parliament. He talked about emergency situations and so forth. For example, if embedded operatives our armed forces were to be deployed in other countries, would Parliament authority be required on that? And could he just point to where his proposal is today? Because the motion obviously doesn't contain that level of detail.
Well, it doesn't contain that level of detail because the draft bill has not yet been prepared, and obviously that level of detail is a matter for debate. What I'm proposing is that Parliament has a fundamental power over government to decide on issues of war and peace and the conflict that goes with it, and I've made it quite clear the caveat is in there of an overriding emergency or threat to people's lives in that sense. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, the government has failed to accept the case put forward in the Chilcot inquiry for stronger safeguards to ensure proper collective consideration by the Cabinet on decisions of vital national importance, most notably the decision to take military action. These are not my words. Instead, the conclusions made by the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee's 2017 publication on the government's response to their report into Chilcot. Their assessment should alarm us all. This government has failed to introduce the proper safeguards into their cabinet decision-making process. Why should we leave it in their hands to make these crucial decisions when they clearly have failed to learn many of the lessons of the past? This report also draws attention to concerns about the ability to ensure ministers take proper advice on the provision of evidence and on how decisions based on this evidence are made.
I thank my honourable friend. And does he agree with me that at the very minimum the lessons learned from the Chilcot inquiry and Iraq should be the basis on which the War Powers Act should be based?
Mr. Shelbrooke, be quiet. I know you feel strongly and I respect that. I'm not having you shouting out. You either undertake now to be quiet or I strongly advise you to leave the chamber for the rest of the debate. Stop it. You are well-intentioned and principled, but you are overexcitable and you need to contain yourself. It requires you to take some medicament, then so be it. Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, I thank my friend for that intervention, and he's quite right. We have to learn the lessons of the past. The Iraq War is something that's seared on the memory of every member who was in this House at the time, and all those millions of people that expressed the deepest concern outside this House of what's going on. So, Mr. Speaker, it's for this House to take matters into its own hands and take back our control, as some might put it. I'm clear that Parliament should have, as an absolute minimum, enshrined in law, the opportunity to ask questions before the government can order planned military action. The questions: is it necessary? Is it legal? What will it achieve? And what is the long-term strategy? It's difficult to argue that requiring governments to answer those questions over matters of life and death would be anything other than a positive step. There is no more serious issue than sending our armed forces to war. It is right that Parliament has the power to support or to stop the government from taking planned military action.
I thank the opposition gentleman for giving way. He's laid out a test which he thinks could be met in emergency circumstances. Doesn't that mean that you may have a situation where British forces need to be urgently committed, yet court action would end up determining whether that could happen or not? And wouldn't it be wrong that judges, rather than the Cabinet, made those kind of decisions?
I'm not quite sure where the honourable gentleman gets that logic from, because it certainly doesn't come. It certainly doesn't come from anything that I have said.
No, order. I'm sorry to have to keep interrupting. This debate must be conducted in a seemly manner, as a number of members on both sides suggested yesterday. Members must calm down. It's as simple and incontestable as that. Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, as I was pointing out, there is no more serious issue than sending armed forces into war and what actions we could or should take as members of Parliament. That is why we're elected to this House. That is what our democratic duty requires us to do. And so, Mr. Speaker, I therefore hope that this motion will command support.
I hope it's a point of order and not a point of frustration. Spit it out, man.
I hope it's a point of order. Could you please advise that if a statute law is passed by this place, it then becomes judicially reviewable by the courts, which was the point made by...
No, that's not a point of order. If the honourable gentleman doesn't trust his own exegesis of the law, that's his problem, not mine. But it isn't a matter for the chair. He's made his own point in his own way, but he's done it in a disorderly fashion and he shouldn't repeat the offence. Jeremy Corbyn.
Every 2 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to get past the point when I'm saying there's no more serious issue in decisions made by Parliament on matters of war and peace and the government taking planned military action. That convention was established in 2003. It was enshrined in Cabinet in 2011, and the then Foreign Secretary gave every indication that he supported the principle of parliamentary scrutiny and parliamentary approval of such a major step. I've outlined the caveats that are there in a case of overriding emergency. But I do think it is very important that the House of Commons, as one of the oldest parliaments in the world, holds the government to account, not just on the immediate decision, but on the longer-term strategy and the implications of the actions that are taken. Going to Afghanistan, going to Iraq, bombing Libya and many others have long-term consequences. I think we all need to know what thought process has gone into those long-term consequences by government and the officials that are advising government. So what I've tried to set out today, Mr. Speaker, is a simple democratic demand. It is not taking an opinion one way or the other on what the government did last week. It is asserting the right of Parliament to assert its view over a government. The executive must be the servant of Parliament, not the other way round. I therefore hope, Mr. Speaker, this motion will command support from all sides of the House as we work to bind this government and any future government to this basic democratic principle on one of the most serious and crucial issues of foreign policy that we face. And I hope today's debate will help us in that process of bringing about a change, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to give way anymore because I'm about to conclude the speech, Mr. Speaker, and well, I don't know why they're cheering the end of the speech if they want to intervene on it. There's no logic there, but then that's their problem, not mine.
Order. I say to member... Order! Resume your seat, Mr. Harper. You don't stand when I'm standing, and that's the end of it. You have sought to intervene. The attempt to intervene has not been accepted. You will now remain seated. The Leader of the Opposition has made it clear that he is bringing his speech to a conclusion. That's his prerogative, and he will do so without being subjected to a concerted effort by people to stop that conclusion. You're a former government chief whip. You do know better than that, and you can do better than that, and you'd better try. And I wouldn't argue the toss with the chair if I were you. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, it is about democracy, it is about accountability, it is about making very serious decisions. That is what MPs are elected to do. And it would bind this government and future governments to that basic democratic principle on the most serious and crucial issues of public policy that we're ever asked to take a decision on. As I said earlier, all those that were here in 2003 during those debates on Iraq remember them very well and remember the questioning very well from the public about what they did and how they voted. That is why we're elected to Parliament. I beg to move, Mr. Speaker, we approve this debate today on the principle that this is an assertion of that great tradition of the advancement of democratic accountability of this House on behalf of the people of this country.
Thank you. Order. The question is that this House has considered Parliament's rights in relation to the approval of military action by British forces overseas. I call... Yes, very much more courteously articulated by the honourable gentleman. Just before I call the Prime Minister, point of order, Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
You give your ruling at this early stage that the vote must go with the voice. There are rumours that the opposition is thinking of voting against its own motion, but the Leader of the opposition has just moved that motion. Would he therefore be entitled, under normal procedures, to do so?
Yes. That is the answer to the question. Yes. And I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to start by paying tribute to the professionalism, dedication and courage of our armed forces. As I said to the House yesterday, there is no graver decision for a Prime Minister than to commit our servicemen and women to combat operations. Understanding where authority and accountability for their deployment and employment lies is of vital importance. So let me begin by being absolutely clear about the government's policy in relation to the convention that has developed, because there is a fundamental difference between the policy and the perception of it that is conveyed in the motion before us today. The Cabinet Manual states, and I quote, "In 2011, the government acknowledged that a convention had developed in Parliament that before troops were committed to the House of Commons, the House of Commons should have an opportunity to debate the matter, and said that it proposed to observe that convention, except where there was an emergency and such action would not be appropriate." More detail on the government's position was then set out in 2016 in a written ministerial statement from the then Defence Secretary, my right honourable friend, the member for Sevenoaks. He wrote, quote, "The exception to the convention is important to ensure that this and future governments can use their judgment about how best to protect the security and interests of the UK. He went on to say, "In observing the Convention, we must ensure that the ability of our armed forces to act quickly and decisively and to maintain the security of their operations is not compromised, and further that, if we were to attempt to clarify more precisely circumstances in which we would consult Parliament before taking military action, we would constrain the operational flexibility of the armed forces and prejudice the capability, effectiveness or security of those forces." So, I will...
I'm extremely grateful for giving way at this stage. She may know that I raised a point of order with the Speaker prior to this debate in asking, and I wonder if she could confirm, is it the case that the National Security Advisor has given intelligence briefings to members of the Labour opposition who are not Privy Councillors, but instead were selected on the basis that they were sympathetic to the government's airstrike campaign?
My understanding is that any intelligence briefings that have been given to Privy Council members of this House, and that all Privy Council members of this House have been invited to attend such briefings. So, Mr. Speaker,
I'm extremely grateful. The Prime Minister has talked about the possibility of there being a compromise on the efficiency and security of British armed forces in any military action if we were to go down the route which has been suggested by the Leader of the Opposition. Would this not be even further magnified where our military action takes place in cooperation with, for example, the United States of America and France and maybe several other countries?
Minister. Well, I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I will be coming on to the point about the issue of the security of our allied forces as well as our own forces a little later on in my speech. And I will give my...
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. When the International Development Secretary gave her interpretation of this on the media recently, and she said that it was always wrong to outsource decisions about war to Parliament because parliamentarians wouldn't have, in any cases, sufficient intelligence, was she representing the Prime Minister and the government's position on the Convention?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that I have just set out the Convention. I am very clear that the government follows that Convention, but the assumption that that Convention means that no decision can be taken without parliamentary approval is incorrect. It is the wrong interpretation of that Convention. I wish, Mr. Speaker, if I may, just to make absolutely clear the response that I gave to the honourable member from the Scottish National Party. I believe that a number of briefings have been given. Those that have been given intelligence briefings that would not be made available to members of this House are Privy Councillors. That is my understanding of the situation. So, Mr. Speaker, I share completely the principle that in a parliamentary democracy, the elected representatives in this House should be able to debate the deployment of British military forces into combat. As I said, I will give way to the honourable gentleman as I've just clarified my response to him.
I'm grateful. I don't mean to test her patience any more than I feel I have to, despite the countering behind it. She says that it is her understanding that only Privy Councillors received intelligence briefings from the National Security Advisor, and I see she's been passed notes along the bench. Can she say from the dispatch box that no Member of Parliament who is not a Privy Councillor did not receive an intelligence briefing from the National Security Advisor?
Briefings have been offered to all members of the House, not just Privy Councillors, subsequent to action. Briefings have been offered to all members of this House subsequent to action. Before action, briefing was only offered to opposition leaders. Mr. Speaker, I will...
Well, Prime Minister, we've spent half an hour listening to the Leader of the Opposition talking about process. Children who've been gassed in Syria are not interested in process, they're interested in action. And will she agree with me, since he refused to take any interventions from me, but can she recall in any time in the opposition leader's 35 years in this House when he has supported any action to countenance military action or legislation to counter terrorism that sends out a clear message that illegal aggression, the likes of which we saw last week, will not be tolerated and has consequences?
Can I say to my honourable friend that my recollection is that the Leader of the Opposition has consistently opposed military action and also consistently opposed us ensuring that our services, that our security services and our law enforcement agencies have the powers they need to be able to deal with terrorism.
Will the Prime Minister allow me? I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, as I'm now on my best behaviour. Is it not surely a matter of degree? For instance, the United States has a War Powers Act already, but I'm not aware that anybody in America has sought to invoke the War Powers Act over the strike that took forward. I don't see that going anywhere at all. Is not the case that if we had sought to commit troops into combat to fight a war, as we did in Iraq in 2003, clearly we would have expected a debate and a vote in this House. But for a targeted military strike designed to uphold international law, the approval of the House would not be necessary as a prerequisite.
Absolutely right. I thank my honourable friend for the point that he has made, and indeed one of the points I made in the exchanges that took place in this House yesterday was that these strikes were of a particular nature, they were targeted, and they were about upholding that international norm in relation to the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons, and they were on a legal basis that had been used by governments previously, which I will come on to in my speech. I will give way to...
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Could you confirm my understanding that those targets which we and our allies had in our sights were eminently manoeuvrable, and therefore clearly the element of surprise of attack was required in order to maximise the opportunity of their destruction?
My honourable friend makes an important point, which I will actually come on to address in my remarks later on in my speech. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Giving way. The Leader of the Opposition said many times in his opening speech that the duties of members of Parliament is to represent those who elected us. Does she agree with me that if this is the limit of our powers, it leaves the many citizens in our overseas territories and dependencies who are not represented in this house, in this place, very vulnerable? Some in this place would not have authorised military action to retake the Falkland Islands in 1982. I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, I think some people wouldn't authorise military action to retake the Isle of Wight if it were invaded.
I think my honourable friend has made his point very well. Mr. Speaker, I will give way one further time, then I'll make progress.
Can I ask the honourable lady if she thinks it's right that members of this House seem to have less say in foreign policy of this country than President Trump?
I was asked this question on a number of occasions yesterday, and I answered it on a number of occasions yesterday. Let no one in this House be in any doubt that neither I nor this government take instructions from any president or any other national government. When we act in what we believe to be the national interest. That is our only concern. And I might say to the honourable lady that she might give a little more consideration to the national interest and to the importance of upholding the international norms of our rules-based order that have kept us safe over the years. Mr. Speaker, I will give way.
Thank you, Mr. I know the Prime Minister supports the conventions of this House, and I think the vast majority of this House will have thought that the actions last week were entirely correct. But would you agree with me that it would be useful if, after the action has taken place, this House could demonstrate the support for the Prime Minister by having a vote on that issue?
Can I say to my honourable friend, and I'm coming on to the issue in more detail in relation to the role of the House, but I think it is absolutely right. The Leader of the Opposition, in several references in his speech, said to the importance of the government being held to account by this House. That is why I came to the House at the first opportunity. That is why I answered every single backbench question in this House yesterday. And it is why I participated in the debate that was the SO24 debate, which had been brought about under the request of the Honourable Member for Wirral South. I will give way one further time and then I must make some progress.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister. She has spoken movingly in recent days of the burden that she carries and the responsibility she feels in committing our troops to action. Her predecessors have also spoken in such terms. But it is necessary that we are led by people who have the courage and resolve to take those decisions. What does she think would be the consequences for our national security if a future occupant of her office lacked that resolve?
These are indeed grave and difficult decisions for a Prime Minister to take, and difficult decisions for a government to take. But it is important that anybody in the position of Prime Minister recognises that there will be times when sometimes it is necessary to say that our troops do need to commit our troops into combat, to commit our armed forces into combat into some shape or form, be that in the more direct defence of our land or our interests, or the defence of international norms, or the prevention of humanitarian suffering. It is imperative that the person who occupies this position is able and willing to take those decisions. Mr. Speaker, I share completely the principle that in a parliamentary democracy, the elected representatives in this House should be able to debate the deployment of British military forces into combat. As I said yesterday, I am deeply conscious of the gravity of these decisions and the way they affect all members of this House. And there are situations, not least major deployments like the Iraq War, where the scale of the military build-up requires the movement of military assets over weeks, and where it is absolutely right and appropriate for Parliament to debate military action in advance. But that does not mean it is always appropriate. It therefore cannot, and I'm going to make some progress, I'm afraid, it therefore cannot and should not be codified into a parliamentary right to debate every possible overseas mission in advance. I will just make a little more progress and then for as the exception makes clear, there are also situations where coming to Parliament in advance would undermine the security of our operations or constrain the ability of our armed forces to act quickly and decisively. In these situations, it is right for the Prime Minister to take the decision and then to be held accountable to Parliament for it. My right honourable friend.
I'm grateful, my honourable friend. I know she wishes to make progress. I was struck by the intervention by the right honourable gentleman, the member for Nottingham East, when he asked of his leader the very specific question about does that mean that any change of, say, embedded forces would deliver the necessity of a parliamentary vote? May I connect that with the question raised about the legislation? Surely this is then the case that had the government decided not, an injunction almost immediately would follow on this legislation, therefore absolutely punching a hole through government action where necessary and leaving complete confusion for us and our allies.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and in this area in particular, clarity of decision is absolutely crucial. It's not just crucial for governments, it's actually crucial for our armed forces personnel, who we are asking to put their lives on the line for us. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Prime Minister for giving way. And nobody, I don't think, disputes the ability of the Prime Minister to act when there is an issue of national security, to act out with consultation with Parliament. However, that is not the case in this case. The President of the United States tweeted the week before the action to suggest this was going to be happening, and her own Cabinet meeting indicated that they were going to be supportive on the Thursday. She could have perfectly well recalled Parliament on the Thursday. Is it not the case that she was just afraid of losing a vote, and that is why she did not recall Parliament?
First of all, can I say to the honourable gentleman, I'm going to come on to the specific issue of the vote that he would have preferred to have seen in relation to the action that took place last week. But he says that nobody is in any doubt of the need of the government to be able to act on itself, on its own decision in a matter of national security. I have to say, having heard the Leader of the Opposition speech, I'm not sure that statement actually flows for every member of this House, because as I understood it, what the Leader of the Opposition was saying was that it should always be the case that Parliament takes a decision in advance of the government taking out. Well, then it's up to. I am now going to make some progress, because I want to set out for the House today 4 fundamental reasons why this exception is right and why it applied in the case of our military action last weekend. First, coming to Parliament before undertaking military action could compromise the effectiveness of our operations and the safety of British servicemen and women. In the case of our actions last weekend, the Syrian regime has one of the most sophisticated air defence systems in the world today. To counter such a system, it is vital to confuse the enemy as much as possible and to conceal the timing and targets of any planned attack. For example, if they had known even the category of target we had identified, in other words, our narrow focus on chemical weapons, this would have allowed them to concentrate rather than disperse their air defences. Or they could also have preempted our attack by dispersing their chemical weapons stocks instead of leaving them at the target sites that we had identified. So, Mr. Speaker, our ability to exploit uncertainty was a critical part of the operation, and that uncertainty was also a critical part of its success. We know the Syrian regime was not aware in advance of our detailed plans. And yet, if I had come here to this House to make the case for action in advance, I could not have concealed our plans and retained that uncertainty. I would quite understandably have faced questions about the legality of our action. The only way I could have reassured the House would have been to set out in advance, as I did yesterday after the event, the limited, targeted and proportionate nature of our proposed action. I would have faced questions about what aircraft and weapons we were planning to use, when the operation was going to take place, how long it was going to last, and what we were going to do. All of this would have provided invaluable information that would have put our armed forces at greater risk and greatly increased the likelihood of the regime being able to shoot down our missiles and get their chemical weapons away from our targets. I was not prepared to compromise their safety and the efficacy of the mission. And to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who from a sedentary position is claiming that it is nonsense to argue about the security of our armed forces, I say that should be at the forefront of our thinking.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister, but 9 days elapsed from the attack on Doha. The President of the United States tweeted about it, and there was a highly publicised cabinet meeting on the morning of the 12th. And on that day, even comments of the Prime Minister in that cabinet meeting were reported in the press. No one here would have been asking for secret details of the attacks. What we would have been asking is what the long-term strategy is for bringing people round the table to discuss the long-term future, as she set out yesterday, was her objective in this attack. But is it likely to increase the possibility of getting those people round the table to bring a solution to the problem in Syria? No, it's not.
The honourable gentleman knows full well that the strikes that were undertaken because of the concerns about the use of chemical weapons. They were not about the longer-term issue about the longer term of the conflict and the civil war in Syria and the resolution of that, and they were not about the issue of regime change. They were about degrading a chemical weapons capability and deterring the use of those chemical weapons.
Yes, is the Prime Minister aware that the comments she's making reflect accurately a Ministry of Justice report made under the previous Labour government in 2009, which stated that any relaxation of prerogative powers would dangerously weaken our ability to respond in a crisis?
My honourable friend makes a very important point in quoting from that particular report. It has to be the case that we are able to retain the flexibility we need to make the decisions necessary for our national security, our national interest, and to be able to act in the way that we have. Wait a minute.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. She knows that decisions that she often has to take are in response to very dynamic security and military situations, and therefore legislating in this place for the mission decision brings with it an inflexibility that would be very unhelpful when targets change, missions change, and rules of engagement sometimes need to be adjusted. She cannot allow her freedom of decision-making to be limited in such a way.
Can I say to my honourable friend that he is absolutely right. It is important to have that freedom and that flexibility. And can I say how striking that comment is coming from he who has served, I believe, in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The second reason, no, I am now going to make progress. There are quite a lot of members who wish to speak in this debate. I've taken a lot of interventions. The second reason is because of the nature of the information that I see as Prime Minister, along with the National Security Council and the Cabinet. The Government makes use of a wide range of sources of information, both those in the public domain and secret intelligence. In this case, drawing on the lessons of the past, we made a rigorous assessment of the available open source material and intelligence about the Duma attack. Indeed, when the Right Honourable Member for Gainsborough looked me in the eye and asked me to tell him that it was the Syrian regime that was responsible, I could do so in part because of the intelligence and assessment I had seen, and because I had discussed that intelligence and assessment with senior security and military officials, the National Security Council and Cabinet. In the post-Iraq era, it is natural for people to ask questions about the evidence base for our military actions, including when we cite intelligence. They want to see all the information themselves. But we have an obligation to protect the safety and security of our sources. We must maintain secrecy if our intelligence is to be effective now and in the future. We have obligations to our partners to protect the intelligence they share with us, just as they protect intelligence we share with them. And we have to be judicious, even in explaining the types of intelligence we use in any given case, or risk giving our adversaries vital clues as to where our information comes from. It is the government... No, I'm going to make some more progress. It is the government that has access to all of that information, but Parliament does not and cannot. So, Mr. Speaker, this isn't a question of whether we take Parliament into our confidence. It is a question of whether we take our adversaries into our confidence by sharing that material in a public forum. Officials have briefed opposition leaders on Privy Council terms. I've set out to the House elements underpinning our assessment, but our intelligence and assessment cannot be shared in full with Parliament. It is my responsibility to decide the way forward based on all the intelligence and information available to government. I should make the decision as Prime Minister with the support of the Cabinet, and Parliament should hold me to account for that decision. I will just give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm really grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. On the evidence for if it was Assad's regime that carried out the chemical attack, I found the statement compelling, and the evidence that the type of helicopter and the movements being part of it very compelling. Would she have been able to share that with the House prior to the attack? Just that evidence?
It's open source, so yes.
Evidence. I was able to share more evidence with the House after the attack than I would have been able to share before the attack, and it is not possible to share all the intelligence on which we base our judgments with the House. The third point, no, I am going to make some progress. Third is our need to work together with our closest allies. A year ago, following the despicable sarin attack at Khan Sheikhoun, the US immediately sought to deter further chemical weapons attacks by launching 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles onto the airfield from which the Khan Sheikhoun atrocity attack took place. But Assad and his regime hasn't stopped their use of chemical weapons. So this weekend's strikes needed to be significantly larger than the US action a year ago, and to be specifically designed to have a greater impact on the regime's capability and willingness to use chemical weapons. And that was firmly in the British national interest. Working together with America and France, and doing so at pace, was fundamental to achieving that effect. But if I had come to the House in advance of this operation to set out the totality of our effort, I would also have had to share with Parliament the breadth of our allies' plans. For this was a combined operation where the totality of our effort was key to delivering the effect. This would not only have constrained their flexibility to act swiftly, it would have fundamentally undermined the effectiveness of their action and endangered the security of our American and French allies. In doing so, we would have failed to stand up to Assad in the face of this latest atrocity. We would have failed to alleviate further humanitarian suffering by degrading Assad's chemical weapons capability and deterring their future use. And we would have failed to uphold and defend the global consensus that says these weapons should never, ever be used. The fourth reason, Mr Speaker, is the legal basis for UK action has previously been agreed by Parliament. As the Honourable Member for Ilford South said so movingly during the statement yesterday, there is a long tradition on both sides of this House that has considered that military action on an exceptional basis, where necessary and proportionate, and as a last resort to avert an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe, is permissible under international law. The three criteria which I set out in my statement yesterday are the same three criteria used as the legal justification for the UK's role in the NATO intervention in Kosovo. And as I also explained, our intervention in 1991 with the US and France, and in 1992 with the US, to create safe havens and enforce the no-fly zones in Iraq following the Gulf War, were also justified on the basis of humanitarian intervention. So, Mr Speaker, it was right for me as Prime Minister, with the full support of the Cabinet and drawing on the advice of security and military officials, to take the decision on this military strike last weekend and for Parliament to be able to hold me to account for it. By contrast, a War Powers Act would remove that capability from a Prime Minister and remove the vital flexibility from the convention that has been established. For it would not be possible to enshrine a convention in a way that is strong and meaningful, but nonetheless flexible enough to deal with what are, by definition, unpredictable circumstances. I'll give way.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the Prime Minister's time on this, but should this motion be passed today, would this mean theoretically that if we're attacked anywhere in the world, we would have to come before Parliament before we would enact a retaliation?
That would not be the upshot of the motion that is before this House today, but it could be the upshot of a War Powers Act that would be brought in the manner that was suggested by the Leader of the Opposition. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman and then to my honourable friend, and then I will.
Grateful to the Prime Minister. If consulting Parliament in advance of this military action against the Syrian regime would have inevitably compromised operational details and intelligence in the way the Prime Minister suggests, what was it about the debate that took place in 2013 about the possibility of military action in Syria that would have compromised those same details had the vote gone the other way?
I say to the honourable gentleman, a rather different set of circumstances in 2013 when that vote was taken by this House. Now, I said that I'd give way to my honourable friend.
Can I thank my right honourable friend? As a former soldier, may I paint a picture where British hostages are taken and a rescue mission is needed? As I understand it from the other side, we'd have to come to this place before such a mission was lodged. Or maybe if the law was painted that way, when actually the best time to rescue them is why we in this place are talking.
Well, my honourable friend, I think, makes an important point, but he has, I think, my understanding is he has understood the potential consequences of what is being proposed on the opposition benches. Mr Speaker, let me be absolutely clear what such a War Powers Act would mean. It would mean many smaller-scale, timely and targeted interventions, like the action we've taken to alleviate further humanitarian suffering by degrading Syria's chemical weapons capability and deterring their use, would become unviable. Unviable because it would significantly reduce the effectiveness of any operations and endanger the safety of our service men and women. As David Cameron stated to the House back in 2014, it is important to reserve the right that if there were a critical British national interest at stake, or there were the need to act to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, you could act immediately and explain to the House of Commons afterwards. Put simply, making it unlawful for Her Majesty's Government to undertake any such military intervention without a vote would seriously compromise our national security, our national interests and the lives of British citizens at home and abroad. And for as long as I'm Prime Minister, that will never be allowed to happen. Mr Speaker, before I just make my concluding remarks, may I say, if I may, apologise to all those who are participating in this debate, because I have to leave the House after I have spoken in order to have a meeting with Cyril Ramaphosa, who is members will understand, has taken over as head of government in South Africa, and I think that is an important for us to do. Mr Speaker, I realise that for some in this House, and especially for those who've not had to do what I have to do, the attractive purity of a democratic principle that Parliament should always decide may still appeal more than the practice of how to ensure an effective military operation that delivers our national interest. But notwithstanding this disagreement, two things I think are clear. First, while we may disagree over my decision not to recall Parliament, and we may disagree over my decision to commit our forces in combat on this mission, and we may disagree over the very principle that I should be able to make such a decision, I hope we can agree over this. From the time I spent at the dispatch box yesterday, no one can doubt my commitment as Prime Minister to being held to account by this House for the decisions I've taken. And second, the mood of the House yesterday was unquestionable. We do have the support of the House for the measures that we took to alleviate further humanitarian suffering by degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and to deterring its future use. A clear majority of this House believe we did the right thing.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I suggest to the Government that we need to reflect very carefully on the important matters that we're debating today? And I would respectfully suggest that the Government should give consideration to bringing forward a bill that would give the protections that many of us in this House are arguing for today. And the reason that I say that is because there are legitimate questions that are being raised as to what should be the scope of the bill and the Act, so that the Government, in exceptional circumstances, still has the power to act. We're not talking about a set of circumstances that binds the Government in all circumstances where it can't act. Of course, that would be ludicrous, and I don't believe anybody supports that. But can I also say, as I rise, that as we're having this debate today, we must keep at the front of our minds the humanitarian situation in Syria and the desire that all of us must have in this House to work together and to work together internationally to bring the war and the suffering in Syria to an end. And let me also say that we ought to commend our armed forces and the way that they conduct themselves, and that we can be grateful that those that did engage in the activity, whether we agreed with that or not last week, returned back to their bases in safety. Mr. Speaker, it is important at this time to reflect on the principles in the debate here. This place may have no constitution, but it has long-held conventions which are based on precedent. In 2013, Parliament was recalled to debate the UK's military response to a chemical attack in Syria. The UK's political system has been turned upside down since then, including, it would appear, parliamentary procedure and parliamentary sovereignty. The timeline of events last week showed our Prime Minister chasing the President's timetable rather than planning a recall. Parliament should authorise military action. It is a disgrace that the Prime Minister appeared beholden to the US President instead of to the UK Parliament. Mr. Speaker, well, I hear gentlemen otherwise saying rubbish. It is important that we do examine the matters of this. And let me say to the House, I will give way in a second, but let me say to the House, it would be my contention, if we were not on recess last week, that we would have had this discussion. So the nub of the problem here, above all else, was the failure of the Government to recall Parliament. There is no way that this House would have been able to avoid a debate on what was happening in Syria, particularly in the light of the tweets that were coming from the US President. I give way to the...
I'm very grateful for the member giving way. I was out last week in my constituency knocking on doors, and as you'll be aware, my constituency is Washington and Sunderland West. And what they said to me is, why weren't the constituents of Washington, the United Kingdom, why weren't their views taken into consideration rather than the views of President Trump of Washington DC?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I find myself in very strong agreement with her, because the fact of the matter is everybody else was discussing the Syrian situation last week. There has hardly been any other subject which has been discussed in our media. And at a time when all our constituents are rightfully concerned of the humanitarian situation, the only people that haven't had a voice are members of this Parliament, and that is to be deeply regretted.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. And would he not agree with me that it is just not acceptable, it is not good enough for the Prime Minister not to seek parliamentary approval before getting our brave servicemen and women involved in a military conflict? As you rightly said, thanks to the tweets of the stable genius, hundreds of millions of people were debating the issue in their house. It just seems that this is the only house where we were not allowed to debate.
I think my honourable friend is correct. And let me say, let me say this respectfully, that we are living in challenging times. We all agree on that. We had the situation of the attack in Salisbury, and it was important that we have tried to reach as broad a consensus as we could have done on this matter. I would simply say to this House, it's in all of our interests that we're able to debate these matters. Nobody is talking about tying the hands of the Prime Minister. All we're asking for is that democracy can take place. I will give way.
Gentlemen, for giving way. I mean, firstly, we should keep in mind that last week's action was a very limited, very targeted piece of action, not a more general engagement. But to his very specific question, why wasn't Parliament recalled, let me provide this answer. Firstly, to have provided full justification to the House would have entailed the disclosure of confidential intelligence. Secondly, it would have inhibited our ability to coordinate with international allies. And thirdly, it would have given our adversaries some sense of the time.
So grateful to the Honourable Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say that is wrong on so many levels. Can I remind the honourable gentleman that we met, we discussed and we voted in 2015 to take action against Daesh. Nobody is saying that intelligence matters have to be declared to members of Parliament. Of course not. What we are talking about are the principles of taking action. Do not hide behind the smokescreen of saying that intelligence information has to be shared. It does not, and nobody would expect that. I will give way one more time.
I'm grateful for my right honourable friend for giving way. The Prime Minister has said that this so-called targeted action would not increase tensions in the region, and yet couldn't give any guarantees about retaliation from different parties. Does my right honourable friend not agree that's exactly the kind of thing we would have debated had this come to Parliament?
Well, I mean, absolutely, and I do wish to see all of us in the United Kingdom taking a leadership role in making sure that we can get rid of the scourge of chemical weapons. That, as I mentioned in my introduction, that we need to work together in the interests of the Syrian people in order to break the logjam of the Geneva talks. That should be our biggest priority in order to do this. I must apologise to the House that I know that many people want to speak, and I do want to make some progress if I can. Can I remind the House that the Father of the House said yesterday, and I quote, "Once President Trump had announced to the world that he was proposing a widespread debate was taking place everywhere, including many MPs in the media, but no debate in Parliament." Mr. Speaker, we should listen to the wisdom of the Father of the House. As the President tweaked reckless comments, simply heightening tensions, the SNP immediately called for the Prime Minister to recall Parliament for last Saturday. We have been clear. Any proposed change to the role of UK forces in Syria must be subject to a vote in Parliament. Mr. Speaker, Cabinet was recalled. Why wasn't Parliament? There is no good answer to that question because the Prime Minister knows she should have done so. As I have already alluded to, precedent has been set. In 2013, the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, recalled Parliament for a debate and vote following a suspected chemical attack on Syrian civilians in the suburbs of Damascus. After the 2013 vote, Professor Malcolm Chalmers of RUSI commented, "It is now hard to see how any UK government could undertake significant military action without the support of Parliament or indeed the wider public." We know what a lack of rigorous analysis and thought can lead to. We must, absolutely must, have learned the lessons from the Iraq War, and we must fully endorse the conclusions
of the Chilcot report. A full debate in Parliament would have allowed for many questions about the UK's military action and role. For example, what is the government's long-term strategy for Syria? I will give way.
The Right Gentleman is very grateful for giving way. Chilcot has been cited a number of times to the benches opposite. Chilcot, the Iraq War was voted on in this place, but it was voted on the basis of incomplete information. What intelligence would the Right Honourable Gentleman propose to compromise to members in this House so they can make a better formed decision, and what analysis has he made of the impact of sharing that intelligence on the operational security of those who prosecute the mission thereafter?
None. How do we... Well, look, I'm trying to be... I can see the Honourable Lady waving her arms. I've already made the point, and if you'd been listening to what I've been saying, I do not expect the government to have to share intelligence information with members of Parliament. And let me also be clear, for any absence of doubt, that I accept the case that has been put, that it is the Syrian regime that have been responsible for the chemical weapons attack. I am happy with the explanation that's been given, and of course in my case I have been made aware of some of the intelligence information. Let's not say that Parliament cannot take action on the basis of being told what it can be told, but it doesn't need to be told what is sensitive intelligence information. That is the way that Parliament has worked, and we're asking that parliamentary democracy continues to take place. Mr. Speaker, taking military action is not easy. We accept that. Finding a way through the morass in Syria and offering hope to the people that is more difficult, but it's an issue that any part of plan for military action has to be discussed. I'll happily give way to my learned friend.
I'm most grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Is there not this difficulty that if we in the House seek to debate in anticipation a military action which is of a high level of specificity, in reality, where the government can't explain the specifics, we are going to be in very considerable difficulty having a sensible debate on that subject. We just look at it realistically, that is in fact going to be one of the issues that's going to have to be addressed, and I hope I may have a chance of speaking about it later.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm grateful to the intervention from the learned gentleman, but let me say, no one's asking that the government should come forward and should be specific to that degree of the action which has been proposed. And I've given... I will not take any more interventions because I must move on. I've already raised the issue of what happened in 2015, when this House took a vote and taking action against Daesh. Nobody is talking about compromising operational activity. It's about the principle of Parliament giving its consent to military action. That's what we are talking about. Mr. Speaker, I must make progress. Preparing the groundwork for peace has to be a fundamental part of any proposed military action, and developing a clear and coherent plan that addresses the humanitarian crisis. Mr. Speaker, it is a damaging tale that the UK spent 13 times as much money on bombing Libya than it did on rebuilding the country at the end of the conflict. We must not be dragged into the reckless rhetoric of the President of the US when he claims mission accomplished. I call on the Government to urgently tell this House, by means of a statement, what its long-term strategy for achieving peace in Syria and helping the nation rebuild after the war. On Saturday, we were presented with the legal advice the Prime Minister relies on to justify Saturday's airstrikes. Mr. Speaker, I repeat my comments from yesterday that the SNP have grave concern with the extent of the legal advice. As I noted yesterday, in the absence of a UN resolution or self-defence, the two clear-cut legal grounds for attack, the Prime Minister's legal reliance is based on averting a humanitarian crisis. Mr. Speaker, Syria is the most besieged and bombed place on earth right now. It is not easy to see how adding warplanes and airstrikes to the Syrian skies avert further humanitarian suffering. Thousands dead, millions fleeing for their lives,
and 400,000 civilians still trapped in appalling conditions, deprived of food, medicine and basic aid. Over 13 million civilians in desperate need of humanitarian aid. And I heard the cry about refugees, and yes, our responsibility for refugees. We can look back on pride to the kinder transport that took place in the months leading up to the Second World War. 10,000 children allowed into this country. Where is that spirit of humanity to deal with the crisis in Syria today? I will give way one last time.
I'm very grateful to the gentleman for giving way. And it's been said that many a true word is spoken in jest. And I think it was the comedian Frankie Boyle who said, the UK cares very much about the Syrians until they reach a beach. We have to make sure that we put as much effort into refugees as we're putting into dropping bombs.
Absolutely, and I would say to my honourable friends from the Nailing and Yard that the situation on the ground in Syria is desperate. So we must not look at Syria through the narrow prism of military action. There are fantastic people, groups and organisations on the ground just getting through each day, and they deserve the international community's full support. I pay tribute to the White Helmets in particular, who have not only saved so many lives, but continuously ran into danger to protect civilians. We must work with the UN and international partners to ensure that all action in Syria meets with international law. I have, Mr. Speaker, grave concerns that the Prime Minister did not wait for OPCW inspectors to complete their visit and investigations in Duma before taking a decision to respond. Mr. Speaker, many countries around the world place constitutional controls on the use of military power. We in the SNP believe in a triple lock on military deployments based on the principle that military action would need to be in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter, properly agreed by government and approved by Parliament. And if I may say so, these are principles that any independent Scottish Government would adhere to. We on these benches believe that the time has come for a War Powers Act. A long-standing policy of the SNP, we believe it will stop situations, as we saw last week, where Parliament is completely bypassed in a reckless fashion. Indeed, having Parliament approval was the position of the party opposite not so long ago. You see, Mr. Speaker, in 2011, when the then Foreign Secretary, William Hague, stated that the UK Government planned to enshrine in law for the future of necessity of consulting Parliament on military action. Then the Political and Constitutional Reform Committee identified an urgent need for greater clarity on Parliament's role in decisions to commit Britain's forces to armed conflict abroad. It recommended the Government should, in the first instance, bring forward a draft parliamentary resolution for consultation and for decision by the end of 2011. We all know this did not happen.
Shameful.
In conclusion, we on these benches warmly welcome the support of the Leader of the Opposition in bringing forward a War Powers Act, and I do hope that we can work together, indeed across this House, with members opposite too, in creating a War Powers Act for this place.
Order. On account of the number of people wishing to take part in this debate, I'm afraid it is necessary with immediate effect to impose a time limit of 5 minutes on each backbench speech. Mr Bernard Jenkin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I will endeavour to be as swift as I possibly can. I think the honourable gentleman for Ross, Skye and Lochaber has just punched a hole in his own argument by responding to my right honourable and learned friend, the former Attorney General, by assuring us that in any debate about some putative military action, nobody is asking the government to reveal specifics. I'm sorry, that's what this place does. We ask about specifics. So you're expecting to have a debate about a forthcoming military action where the government would be reluctant to reveal the targets, the objectives of the operation, the nature of the deployment, and this is ridiculous. I will come back to this point in a minute, but Mr. Speaker, I rise as chair of the Political and Constitutional political Parliamentary Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which covers both the question of strategic thinking in government and this question of the relationship between government and Parliament. My predecessor committee produced 3 reports on strategic thinking in government, and I would just challenge the Secretary of State for Defence, my right honourable friend who's in his place, that while the government has listened to the arguments and developed its capacity for strategic thinking, the published literature of government is way behind the curve in dealing with the situations we now face. And I think it underlines how we have been asleep to a large extent and complacent about the security that we enjoy in this world. That we are effectively now confronted by 2 great powers who are intent on subverting the international legal order, and this problem in Syria is just a symptom of the superpower conflict that is already taking place, and that is simply not reflected in the 2015 SDSR or the 2015 National Security Review, and I think we will need to attend to these matters with some urgency. But I wish to concentrate on the more immediate question about the relationship between government and Parliament. It is a complete misconception that there is an established constitutional convention that Parliament votes on the question of foreign deployments. This is a relatively new fashion. The Cabinet Manual says this. The Cabinet Manual has no constitutional status whatsoever. It has no legal force. It is merely the expression of the opinion of a particular Prime Minister at a particular time, not in fact even drafted by this Prime Minister. And it is vague. The basis of the relationship between government and Parliament, if I may just make the point, the basis of the relationship between government and Parliament is that Parliament controls laws and Parliament controls the supply of money to the executive, and Parliament is required to give its confidence to the government in office for that government to continue in office. And it scrutinises government decisions and holds ministers accountable. But I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, accountability is not the same thing as control. This Parliament does not control the executive. We don't run the country. We hold the government accountable. And a Parliament should not seek to directly control the decisions of ministers. I give way to my honourable friend.
Let's go to my honourable friend for giving way. Will you not go a little further and agree with me that if indeed we cross that boundary, and if indeed we make this place into the executive, we're actually reducing the ability of this place to hold the government to account because we ourselves have been forced on a 3-line whip to vote for it?
I do think it is ironic and that the decision to go to war in Iraq is continually held up as an example of how these decisions should be made, when in fact the determination of the then Prime Minister to bring the decision to Parliament actually blurred the whole debate and made the debate about a whole lot of factors which were irrelevant to the actual question as whether it was a sensible decision to go to war in Iraq or not. And to hold that up as an example of how decisions should be made, it seems ironic that so many members of that House actually regret taking that decision. And it actually is easier to hold the government accountable if we say, you, the government, make the decision and we will judge you on your performance after the event. And if I may say so, when my right honourable friend received her seals of office from Her Majesty, she did not just take on the right to decide when and where and how our armed forces should be deployed, but she took on the obligation intrinsic to her office to exercise her judgment on proper advice in consultation with her cabinet on military deployments of this nature, and then to bring those decisions to this House when she has made them. The Chilcot report has been laid, and yes, my committee has considered the Chilcot report, and we've made recommendations to how government procedures might be improved in order to make sure that that legal advice is not concealed from the Cabinet, that proper procedures are followed in government, and we've recommended in particular, on the basis of a proposal from the Better Government Initiative, that it would be a good idea if the Cabinet Secretary had some mechanism to call out a Prime Minister who was deliberately bypassing proper procedures in government. And that, the government has so far rejected that, that recommendation. But I hope the government will continue to consider how we can be reassured that proper procedures in government are being followed. But my right honourable friend's commitment to her sense of accountability and proper procedure seems to be absolutely unchallengeable.
No, order. Well, we're quite extraordinarily grateful to the honourable gentleman, but his speech is over. Well, we're very greatly obliged to him. George House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to start by saying that, from a purely personal point of view, I accept that on occasions the use of military force is necessary in achieving humanitarian aims. And I think most of us in this House, regardless of which benches we sit on, accept that as a principle that probably has to be correct. So what we're actually, for most of us now debating, are the circumstances in which we take those decisions. And I want to concentrate the remarks I have in the few minutes available to me on that specific point. I think it's worth starting from the perspective, a lot of honourable and right honourable members have argued that the United Nations should be front and centre in the decision-making process. And you know, in principle, that sounds like a good thing. And my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, quoted Articles 3 and 28 of the UN General Assembly adopted Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which says, and it bears repetition, everyone has the right to life, liberty and the security of person, and Article 3, and everyone in Article 28 states everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realised. They are laudable objectives that all of us could easily subscribe to. The difficulty we have with the United Nations, however, is that the way in which Russia can exercise its veto at the Security Council, which they do regularly and repeatedly, means that the achievement of those high ideals that were set out by the United Nations in 1948 become increasingly difficult to achieve when one permanent member of the Security Council effectively prevents those ideals being carried out in practice by the use of a veto. I will give way to the right honourable Chair.
Very grateful for the honourable gentleman. I think he's making an extraordinarily central point. Does he agree with me that the whole structure of the P5 essentially depends on the assumption that all members of the permanent members of the Security Council have in mind to enforce the international rules-based order, and where that breaks down, we have a fundamental problem?
Quite right. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I think he's just saying what I said, using different words. So, insofar as that's the argument I'm using, I accept what he's saying. The other point I wanted to, before I move on to another matter, I did want to say a further word about Russia. There is, in some quarters, a view that Russia, if not benign, certainly is a neutral force in all of these matters. And I said on the part of some people, the honourable lady shaking her head, I would never have thought such of her. And some people do, I think, genuinely and sincerely believe that. I spent 11 years and resigned because I'd spent 11 years and I thought that was long enough, as a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee. And there are things that aren't appropriate that you find out if you're a member of that committee that you can't talk openly about. One thing I will say is that I've seen in real time how Russia tries repeatedly to interfere with the apparatus of state through cyber attacks, and even in terms of the confidentiality of products in the defence industry. And so any idea that Russia is this friendly state that we can all rely on, frankly, is not borne out by the facts. I just want to conclude by saying a word about what the Prime Minister had to say earlier. She did say that she came to the House at the first possible opportunity. Well, I want to ask the question, did she? And secondly, she referred to intelligence that cannot be shared with Parliament. Now, I'll deal with each of those 2 points separately. Unlike the honourable gentleman for Harwich and North Essex, I do accept that the convention that the Prime Minister has relied upon to justify what she did is an appropriate convention. And I'd just like to what it basically says towards the end is that Parliament will be given the opportunity to debate decisions to commit troops to armed conflict, and except in emergency situations, that debate would take place before they were committed. Now, it's a slightly different. First of all, I accept there have to be exceptions, and any legislation or convention would have to allow for that fact. I would argue, however, that the Prime Minister could have recalled Parliament last week, and we could have had a debate not about the intelligence that was involved, but certainly the open source materials she referred to, and this Parliament could, on the basis of a general resolution about humanitarian ends, have come to a conclusion. So I reject that assertion on the Prime Minister's part.
Thank you. The honourable gentleman has completed his oration. He has. I'm grateful to him. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parliament is doing its correct duty, admittedly assisted by you, Mr. Speaker, in ensuring that there were 6 hours of debate yesterday and a further 3 hours of debate today. But these constitutional issues are not new. Indeed, it is at the heart of the Glorious Revolution, and one of the clauses of the Bill of Rights, which is still our law, is that the raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it be with the consent of Parliament, is against law. And that is why every 5 years an armed forces bill is passed to ensure that the armed forces that are available to the executive are approved by Parliament. This last happened in 2016 when the Armed Services Act was renewed. And on that occasion it passed its second reading without a division. It passed its third reading without a division. There was uniform consent within this House that the armed services should exist on a similar basis to that under which they have existed since 1689. The Leader of the Opposition did not choose to put down an amendment to put any limits on how the armed services could operate. He did not choose to put down an amendment to say that the government could not act without the specific consent of Parliament on every occasion. The bill was passed and it recognised the proper constitutional settlement and the separation of powers. An executive and a legislature are different things and have different responsibilities. I, as you know, have the highest respect for the leader of the SNP within this House, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Ross, Skye and Lochaber. But I think he made an error in his speech when he thought that this House ought to give pre-approval, because the job of this House is to hold the executive to account, not to try and run the executive by remote control.
Thank you, honourable gentleman, very much. If it is the executive's idea to go to war or to engage in military action, shouldn't this House be holding the executive to account for its thoughts, ideas and policies?
The executive is being held to account today. The Prime Minister has spent 6 hours yesterday in this House being held to account and a further hour today. I give way to the honourable lady, my neighbour.
I am very grateful for the honourable member, my neighbour, that he gives way. Surely this debate isn't about a collective decision about the action that's been taken and taking, putting the armed forces at risk. It is about a process that we are collectively happy and agreed with in this House. And clearly, that we are having this debate today points to the fact that there isn't a collective agreement about the process.
The honourable lady is absolutely right, as the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, was earlier, when he said today's debate is about process. And what I'm trying to say is that the process is established, has been established for centuries, and is highly effective, because the executive is only the executive as long as it commands the confidence of this House. It would have been open to the opposition, instead of going for an SO24 debate, to ask for a vote of confidence in Her Majesty's government. And I think that would have been the right thing to do, having listened carefully to the Leader of the Opposition's speech, because the opposition fundamentally does not have confidence, or its leadership does not, to have made this decision. And then we would have seen whether this House had confidence in the executive to make the decisions that are the legitimate business of the executive. I won't give way again, because time is short. And if that were to happen, then we would know that the use of force had not been agreed by this House, but it is a retrospective agreement, and it is established in our Constitution and has been for the longest series of years. And that's very important, because an executive has the confidential information that allows it to make the decisions. The Leader of the SNP in this House said, why was the Cabinet called when Parliament wasn't? Well, the obvious reason that the Cabinet was called is that we have Cabinet government in this country. The Prime Minister cannot act on her own. The Prime Minister has to act with the consent of the Cabinet. That is how our constitutional functions. Of course, I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful for the honourable gentleman. We'll not concede that in any military action since the Iraq War, consent of Parliament has been sought on every occasion before troops have been engaged.
This is not correct. The bombing raids on Libya, retrospective consent was given by this House. It was not sought in advance. And that is the issue that goes to the heart of this matter. That yes, we have a flexible constitution, but it is not right to say we have no constitution. The flexible constitution allows a government to come to this House when it is considering certain types of action, where no secret information needs to be given out, where there may be a long-term plan for an invasion or whatever it is. But it also allows the government the flexibility to act when times are urgent and business is pressing and the information is of the greatest sensitivity. And that was why I was making the point that it was right and inevitable that the Cabinet had to be consulted, because that is where power rests, but absurd to propose that the House of Commons could give its consent, because in fact the only way the House of Commons can consent is by legislation. And then we would need to go to the other end of the palace and ask their lordships as well. And by the time you've passed a law saying that we can engage in conflict, the whole conflict's over. And the issue here is that the Armed Forces Bill already covers it, and that bill was passed unanimously. This House gives confidence in the government and controls supply. The armed forces cannot go to war, not only if the Armed Forces Bill hasn't been passed, but if supply is not voted to allow the Army, the Navy and the Air Force to go about its business. That is where we have control every year on the actions of our military. So we have it quinquennially, we have it annually, we have confidence or not in the government. This is our correct, our established constitutional situation. There are ways for the opposition to deal with a government that it does not approve of, and that is by a vote of confidence. That it has not chosen to go down this route actually shows that the opposition is of a pacifist tone, and that may be honourable and it may be noble, but it is different from upsetting our constitution merely to entrench in action.
And extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman. Sir Vince Cable.
Mr. Speaker, my approach to this question, I think, was well captured by some of the independent-minded Labour backbenchers yesterday, and particularly the member for Birmingham Yardley, when she said, if only the Prime Minister had asked me, I would have been inclined to support it. But she didn't ask, and as a result, missed a significant opportunity to build a consensus in here and support within the country. And she has clearly received other advice. I was very struck in the middle of last week. There was an avalanche of editorials, and notably one by the Prime Minister's former colleague, the editor of the Evening Standard, saying that, of course, Parliament must not debate this issue. And it's got nothing to do with high-minded constitutional principles, nothing to do with military secrecy. The argument was we might lose, and if we lose, that would be terrible for our prestige vis-à-vis France. Now, there are, of course, more serious arguments, and they've been aired, and they were put by the Prime Minister on grounds of secrecy and national security, and I respect those. I am a Privy Councillor. I benefited from the briefings which have been available. But I think we are here around an issue of trust. I like to think that in this House, in the country, we've progressed beyond the poisonous legacy of the Iraq War. We're not in the position of the United States, where the President's at war with his own intelligence agencies. I think we do have trust and should have trust in the advice they give us. And if the Prime Minister had any doubt about this, she should have been reassured 3 to 4 weeks ago when she came on the Salisbury question. And she said to us, look, there are things I can't explain. There are facts and information. And what happened was that almost everybody on this side of the House, except for the opposition front bench, Nationalists, Liberal Democrats, Labour, took her word as it should have been. And I think she could have done this on this occasion, but because she has chosen to ignore a practice established by Mrs Thatcher, by Tony Blair, David Cameron, admittedly difficult circumstances, we're now in the position of having to talk about legislative remedies for something that should have been accepted on the basis of trust. I will take an intervention.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way, but I don't understand the logic of his argument. He's admitted that there are circumstances which would mean that the House could not be fully informed. The House would therefore be having a debate and making an ill-informed, by definition, decision. What's the sense in that?
Well, of course, not all information could be made available, and that is why having trust in the Prime Minister, which I do as an individual, and trust in our security services and military, which I do, are absolutely imperative. But if that is in place, I think the House would have a mature debate on the principle, and would have done. And I think the Prime Minister would have had a significant majority here had she followed that path.
You're grateful. The right honourable member used to be a member of the government, under the coalition government, and therefore made decisions as part of that government. He's now part of the legislature. Does he not accept that there is a distinction? He says he trusts the Prime Minister, and surely that's what this debate is all about today.
Yes, I'm all too well aware I've had to fight my way back into the legislature. I'm no longer a member of the government. But when I was a member of the government, I did support military intervention here. I think on that occasion, Parliament got it wrong. I think it got it wrong over the Iraq War. But it was a necessary discipline. And it's a pity that we're now having to talk about legislative remedies that was a perfectly good and sound convention that successive Prime Ministers were following, but this one is not. So that is all I wish to say about the process issues. No, but let me press that. I just want to raise several very specific questions of substance that I don't think were dealt with in the debate yesterday. The first, which I raised and the member for Rushcliffe raised, is this a one-off operation? Or is this a continuous series of strikes that we need to be prepared for? And that's not an academic question. There is a lot of open source material which suggests that the number of chemical attacks in Syria is far, far greater than the number of, I think, 5 that was being used yesterday. The White Helmets, the Syrian Human Rights Organization, have come up with a figure of 213 in the last 5 years. In other words, every week, the Syrian armed forces are using chemical weapons. Low-level divisional commanders with crude chemicals, notably chlorine. And it strikes me as being perfectly plausible that they will do it again. And the question then is, what is the threshold on which we once again intervene? Is it any use? Is it a number of deaths? Is it the President of the United States being indignant because he'd seen something on television? What is the threshold for continuing involvement in this struggle? And that's all the more reason why we need to have parliamentary authorisation for continuing action. My second question relates indirectly to that, which is about the role of the President of the United States. I regard the United States as an ally, as a friendly country with which we have long and strong bonds. But I think we all have problems with a president who is erratic, capricious. He's regarded with open contempt by the public officials who've worked with him, and who, even now in the middle of this crisis, seems to regard President Assad and President Putin as less of a problem than Stormy Daniels and Robert Mueller. Now, the question is, in our continuing dealings with the major power of the Western world, where do we go? We do know in the last few days he's introduced into his administration John Bolton, who is absolutely open that if there are further strikes, he wished to include Iranian targets, which we know will inflame the issue in relation to Israel, who wants to derail the agreement on nuclear weapons with Iran. I would like some assurance at the end of this debate that the British government is holding fast with France, with the rest of the European Union, in honouring and supporting that agreement and not being over-influenced by the American administration. My third and final question relates to Russia. In the statement, the Prime Minister linked Salisbury with the chemical weapons attack. What is very striking is that we have followed the United States, and maybe rightly, and military action. We have not followed the Americans in introducing penal sanctions on oligarchs and stock market dealings. The impact is blatantly obvious. The Russians must be asking themselves, why haven't they done it? Are they afraid of retaliation? Are there vested interests in the city? That's the kind of question which we need an answer to. We should have had answers to those questions last week, and I hope we will improve the processes of this House to make sure they happen in future.
Mr. Nicholas-Bowles.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I observe that in this debate, for all that at times it has become heated, that actually we agree on much. We all agree that decisions to take military action must be brought to this House and explained to this House in detail as soon as possible after they have happened. We all agree that the Prime Minister and ministers must be held to account by this House as often as this House wants for the decisions that they have taken in regard to that military action. We all actually, I think, agree that substantial long-term military engagements, what I would call, borrowing a phrase from President Obama, wars of choice, that they must be brought to this House in advance of the commitment. I don't think there's anyone here, for all that many of us believe that the decision in 2003 to invade Iraq was a mistake. None of us believe that it was a mistake for this House to debate that decision and be given an opportunity to vote on it. So we agree on that principle too. I give way.
I'm most grateful for giving away. He's speaking extremely convincingly. However, he's quite wrong on that point. I actually think the great mistake in 2003 was that Tony Blair did come to this House and did secure top political cover for himself by getting a vote. And had we not had a vote, it would be much easier for many of us to hold him to account thereafter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my honourable friend for making that point, which I heard him make earlier, and I think it is a very interesting one. I guess my conclusion is that it is simply not realistic to think that a major modern democracy can invade another country where there is no immediate national security threat, there is no immediate national interest that is at risk, and not come to its parliament and explain its strategy and receive approval for it. Though I do accept the argument that he makes that that then limited the power of parliament to hold government to account for its decision. So I'll just briefly now focus on what I think are the 2 points of disagreement. We are disagreed on the question of which military actions should not require a prior vote in Parliament, and we are disagreed on what form the convention should take. Should it be statute, or should it be a convention unwritten, as so many of our conventions are? And on the first question, I think we would all accept that if troops landed on the beaches of the Isle of Wight, as was said earlier, that the Prime Minister should be able to act that very night without a prior vote of Parliament. I suspect that many of us, I'm not sure about the Leader of the Opposition, that many of us would accept that if one of our NATO allies were attacked, let's say that Russian troops rolled into Estonia on a Saturday afternoon, I suspect that many of us would believe that fulfilling our duties under the NATO treaty should also not require prior parliamentary authorisation through a vote. However, I do believe there are difficult cases, and I believe that we saw, and I voted in one of the most difficult cases, and that was when we last were asked whether we should respond to a chemical weapons attack by President Assad on his own people in Syria. That, of course, is the vote that took place in 2013. And my contention is, Mr. Speaker, is that we made a fundamental error. We should never have held that vote. It is not just that we were wrong to vote as we did collectively in Parliament, to reject action, that the government, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary were wrong to bring that to Parliament and ask for a vote, for the very reasons that have been laid out so well by honourable members, particularly those honourable members with military experience. This Parliament did not have the information necessary to make that decision. This Parliament could not share in the intelligence information about what President Assad was up to. And as a result, Assad went away and saw that we were not going to act when he used those chemical weapons. And what did he then do, as the leader of the Liberal Democrats has pointed out, serially, on not just 4 or 5 occasions, but on many occasions since then, he has used chemical weapons because he saw that the West was never going to do anything about it. And the reason why the United States didn't do anything about it, and the reason why France didn't do anything about it, was because of the vote in this House. They were all going to act until we were given a vote, which we should not have been given, to question the Prime Minister's judgment that action should have been taken, and we rejected his advice, and as a result, the Syrian people have suffered much, much more. We made a fundamental error which cost many hundreds of lives of Syrian families and Syrian children. So this is not an arcane debate about process. This goes to the heart. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, in my conclusion, I would urge honourable members to resist the suggestion that we should put these matters into legislation. The genius of our Constitution is that it is not written down. The genius of it is that it is based on convention, and the genius of convention is that convention can evolve in response to actual facts. And the convention that, yes, it is right that there has now become a convention that Parliament has a vote on military action in many circumstances. That convention, rightly, through the decision of this Prime Minister in this last weekend, is evolving again to re-establish the idea that when a major humanitarian crisis takes place, she should be able to act and come to Parliament afterwards.
Mr. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I say it's a huge privilege to follow the honourable member for Grantham, and it's great to see him in such fine form. I agree with almost everything that he said, although he will parse the course when it comes to 2013. But what he has outlined today, Mr. Speaker, on the principle of the authority of our government to take the decisions that were taken last week, it rests with them. They have the authority, they have the justification, they have access to all the intelligence, to the evidence, and they are duty-bound not only to defend this nation, but national interests and the international standards with which this House agrees. So I agree most fundamentally that the decision rests with government, and it is one for government to make. And Mr Speaker, just prior to the Honourable Member for Grantham, the Right Honourable Member for Twickenham was making his contribution. And I have to say, I'm increasingly impressed by the principled position that I hear from the Right Honourable Member. I wouldn't have had as much contact with him over the many years, but in his return to Parliament I listen very carefully to what he has to say and the contributions that he makes in this chamber. He cites 2013. He cites the principle of parliamentary approval in 2013, yet decries the fact that this Parliament did not approve. And the consequence of our Prime Minister charged with the defence of this nation, our interests and international standards, in not seeking the comfort of parliamentary approval, is to put in a process and remove that decision-making ability from her. That seems to me fundamentally wrong, Mr Speaker. It would be wrong for this Parliament to remove that power from our government on the basis of a decision which was the right one to take, was constitutionally and legally taken with the best advice available. If we all agree that it was the right thing to do, why should we believe it is now appropriate to consider this House putting in place a legislative barrier that has the potential to stop the right decision being taken when it needs to be taken? And I have to say the title of this motion doesn't take us very far today, nor does the speech of the Leader of the Opposition. I've learned nothing more about what actually it is he wants to achieve from a War Powers Act. But know this, it really matters not what this Parliament passes as a War Powers Act. If our action does not adhere to the 7th Charter of the UN, the 7th Article of the UN Charter, then it's illegal. Wouldn't matter if we had parliamentary approval or not. We either take action which adheres to the UN Charter, or we don't. We take action which is internationally, legally justified, or we don't. But when we look, Mr Speaker, at a brief history of the Leader of the Opposition, I think there would be much stronger imprimatur to the arguments that he's putting forward if he had ever believed it was appropriate to act against a monster or a despot or a dictator internationally, ever. He hasn't done so. He refuses to do so, and a short and a quick glance at history demonstrates it. Whenever UN peacekeepers needed to be rescued from Sierra Leone, the Leader of the Opposition voted against. Whenever the UN, whenever we took action in Kosovo and Bosnia, the Leader of the Opposition was against those actions. I'm not going to give way because, well, I will, because I'll get an extra minute. Thank you very much.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, but I think the substance of the debate today is not about the intention or the previous voting record of the Leader of the Opposition. It is about process, and I think that is what his speech should be concentrating upon today.
I think, Mr Speaker, if we focus just simply on process today and ignore principle, then there is a huge mistake. I am looking very much at the reasons why. I will, certainly, yeah.
Thank you very much. I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, but he talks about dictators and tyrants elsewhere in the world. But the UK took no action against Mugabe, it took no action against Pinochet, and regime change is illegal under international law. So the problem is, if we start to flaunt international law, how do we challenge others?
Well, we haven't, of course, Mr Speaker, flaunted international law. After Kosovo, I think it's a very clear legal justification for humanitarian purposes, and I think that has been outlined quite clearly. Even going back to the UN resolution in 2013, Articles 1 and 21 specifically provide for military action where there has been a breach or a failure to adhere to the Chemical Weapons Prohibition Charter. That is there. The UN has been talked about, and everyone knows the process and the problems that we have had with getting Russian approval at Security Council position for action. The UN did back action against for the first Gulf War. The UN mandated action for the first Gulf War. The Leader of the Opposition put down motions in this House condemning the UN for giving its approval for such actions. And it does matter because this motion before this House today, I suggest, is not about the noble justification of the introduction of a legislative barrier for our government on taking action. It is because there are those within this place who dress up as noble their position, but all they want to do in each and every instance is frustrate the ability of this government or the international community to take action against tyrants.
I'm very grateful, Honourable Gentleman. He is very kind. But this is not about the voting record of the member for Islington North. This is about a principle or a practice going forward where 650 members of Parliament representing the people of the United Kingdom make a decision on this. It's not about those who happen to find themselves in certain positions in government. It's about Parliament having oversight on what they're doing.
And that's the point that you've made. And there are people, Mr. Speaker, who genuinely believe what has just been articulated by the honourable member. There are people who genuinely have a principled position and on every occasion will take a decision on the basis. I don't have any further time. I think I should conclude because I've taken a number of interventions, but my good honourable friend there, I don't want to dismiss him. People do have the ability to take a principled decision and a stand on each and every occasion that we consider military action internationally. The reason why I highlight the Leader of the Opposition's record is he brought forward this motion. He is suggesting that this government should be frustrated from taking decisions that are in our national interest, in defence of our nation, or in standing for international standards and international norms. He suggests there is some noble principle behind the position that he is putting forward. I suggest there is not, Mr. Speaker. It is a cover for impotence and inertia.
Mr. Richard Benyon.
Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start by saying what a privilege it is to follow such a thoughtful and principled speech by the honourable gentleman, the member for Belfast East. I think most members of this House, certainly myself and certainly the Prime Minister, are naturally cautious when it comes to deploying members of our armed forces and putting them in harm's way. And there is a risk that has been well articulated in the last 24 hours in this House, from intervention, of course, and we pay the price of past interventions that have been wrong. But there is, too, a price of not intervening. And we need to understand the dynamics of events when governments decide whether or not to deploy our troops. And in doing so, we need to understand the nature of conflict. And we think too often that conflict is between two opposing armed forces, one seizing and holding ground, and those kind of conflicts are easy to understand. But we live in a world where there's hybrid warfare, there is counterinsurgency operations, where we could be talking about an operation to rescue a downed pilot. We could be talking of a drone attack against individuals who present a direct ability to harm our constituents, and decisions have to be taken very quickly. And so it comes down to the nature of our leaders and what goes through their minds and how they make decisions at that time. Now, there is a perfectly honourable tradition in this country of pacifism. There are pacifists with whom if I'd been around at the time, would probably have profoundly disagreed, but who have a certain nobility, who in 1914 stood up against an enormous rush to war and said, no, we think this is wrong. And many of them paid a huge price for doing that. The Leader of the Opposition has been a frequent visitor to my constituency, to Greenham Common. He spoke with pride about his mother's time spent outside the wire of that, and visiting the atomic weapons establishment at Aldermaston. I can respect and totally disagree with him and indeed his mother for the decisions they were taking at that time, but I can respect them. I would respect him more if he came to this House today saying, look, this is where I'm from. I will not support this country going to war, and I will therefore constrain not only this government but future governments from doing that, and I would have so much more respect for him if he did that. I feel when I've sat through many debates and I've participated in debates when we have made the wrong decision and when we have made the right decision. And too often those debates come down to arguments about tactics. And what this House should do in those circumstances is consider strategy. And to me, the strategy in the last few days has been obvious. It's about whether we condone or are able, or by our inaction, are able to sort of shrug our shoulders and walk away from the grotesque image of children coughing up blood and spittle because they have been gassed in a cellar by a monster. And that is the image. We can talk about process, and honourable gentlemen on both sides have been talking about process. But that is the thought that we have to hold in our mind.
On that point, the honourable member may be interested to know that a Syrian doctor in Swansea approached me to say that his wife's family, his brother and husband, were under a gas attack where their 2-year-old died in front of them, and is now telling me that the doctors in Duma are saying that the Syrians, at the point of a gun, are saying, unless you give a testimony, doctor, that there wasn't a gas attack, we'll be killing your children.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman needs to look at a lot more of the open source material that I have looked at, where people, and on the BBC the other night, interviewing the parents of children. And, you know, he can follow some of the rather eccentric people who were in Parliament Square yesterday, or he can follow the facts, and I strongly suggest he does the latter.
He said he was agreeing with you.
I'm sorry, I think my honourable friends say they misunderstood. I do apologise, honourable gentleman. I think I misunderstood the point. If I made that mistake, I do apologise to him. The Leader of the Opposition spoke about the Salvation poll, and I would just ask him to consider this when talking about polls. Were those 54% of the people who were asked in that poll, were they given details of the exact measures that the government were having to take, the complications of controlling an operation with 2 other nations partners? Were they talking about the difficulties of trying to put together an operation that was seeking to minimise the risk of collateral damage? Were they talking to those people in that poll about ensuring the secrecy of the targeting? And I think that the measures that are needed to be taken in these sorts of events are so complicated that talking about it in terms of a public opinion poll where it is a binary decision, and indeed the context of a debate in this House, makes it extremely difficult. And what sort of debate would we have? I've sat through debates where people will say, I will not walk through the division lobby with the government until I have had more details of the operations that are planned. Unless I hear that there will be X, Y and Z measures being taken. Everybody who has had anything to do with military operations knows that the plan falls apart when the first shot is fired, and you are then in the hands of events. And so I, as a former member of the executive, I found coming to this House or being quizzed in front of a select committee quite tiresome at times. When you immerse yourself in the details of issues, sometimes being held to account is not much fun. Now, as a backbencher, I find holding the government to account enormous fun, and I find it very invigorating. But that doesn't preclude us from trying to do what is right. And the problem is there are some elements of this House for whom this has become a vanity operation. And this is more serious than that. And I hope that we therefore tread very carefully when it comes to doing this. We have the complication of an Article 5 commitment whereby if one nation of NATO is invaded, we are treaty bound. We are treaty bound to respond. And so I urge honourable members on both sides of the House to think very carefully before going down the path presented today by the Leader of the Opposition.
Catherine West.
I'm very pleased to speak in this debate and hope that I will be making this contribution regardless of which party is in power. At a meeting, at a reception in your apartments, Mr. Speaker, you were asked who were the best orators ever in Parliament. And you said there were many, but two that you often quote are the member for Rushcliffe, who today sadly is not in his place, and also you recalled the now deceased Right Honourable Robin Cook. And I know that my honourable friend, the member for Islington North, has referred to his speech this afternoon. I think that goes to the heart of why we're here today, that in fact the role of Parliament is important, because there is an element of having to persuade, not just one another, but hopefully to persuade the country of our views, of our principles and of our ideas. And I think it is an important principle that came out of the Chilcot inquiry, and that was very lengthy. I was on the shadow front bench for hearing that report and had to pinch myself to stop crying at times, the pain that was in that report. And I think today we have to reflect on our learning from that report, not just the importance of Parliament and the importance of our role to scrutinise the role of the executive, but also those other two key elements, namely the plan. And the member for Wirral South spoke in such fantastic terms yesterday of her commitment, and indeed the cross-party group for Syria, on their steadfastness towards the Syrian people, about the importance of a plan. And I think that has been one of the sticking points over the last week, that there has been a lack of a sense of that, of what do we do next. This feels fine for perhaps this weekend to some degree, but what happens next? And thirdly, the important point, of course, on the high-quality need for intelligence and evidence. And that goes back to what was crudely referred to as dodgy dossiers, but I think has haunted us in our political debate for so many years. And I think we still do need to ask those questions. And I think many of us make no apology for asking questions. That is our job as backbench members or whatever role that we have.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Would she agree with me that when somebody asks a probing questions on these types of issues, it is not fair and right to accuse those people of being as apologists or traitors?
I often feel that the language used can stop us from getting to the goal that we want to achieve, and that is certainly the case in any question around peace and war. I also wanted to briefly mention, and it has been a subject of today's debate, when Lord William Hague in this chamber in 2011 did commit himself to, or commit others to, enshrine in law this kind of idea, whether it was the exact legal language or whether the exact view that he wanted to put across. And I understand that he has changed his mind. And I didn't have time, due to other commitments, to listen to his contribution this morning, but I will go back and listen to it, because I'm interested as to why it felt pressing when he was in this place, but now that he's not in this place, it's not so pressing. And I think there is a certain feeling that you have, or a mantle that you have on your shoulders as a parliamentarian in this House. I don't think it applies to the other place in the same degree, that sense of responsibility, that sense of the ballot box, that sense of you are pushed here. And you do have to live up to that responsibility. And so I would like just really to conclude and leave a few minutes for other people who want to make other contributions, that there was plenty of time last week to recall Parliament, and I wish that we'd had yesterday's debate, perhaps not with every single security detail there, but I wish that we had had that debate, and I think many of us could have taken perhaps losing a vote, or winning a vote, or whatever happened with that vote, but at least we would have done what we always do, which is to debate, which is to contend, which is to get cross, which is to get sad, which is to get happy, which is to do what we do in this place and to go through the lobbies and to produce a result for the people we represent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Nadine Dorries.
Speaker, I think one of the issues, it's an honour to follow the Honourable Lady, I think one of the issues in this debate is that quite often when we debate issues of military intervention, we do get it quite wrong. In 2013, is that on the basis of our very limited information that we cannot be privy to. In 2013, this House was recalled to debate, discuss and vote upon a motion to approve military intervention against Syria on the basis of Assad's use of chemical weapons in the past. That time it was Syria and 1,700 people died, and who knows how many of those were children. It was an ever-worsening situation. It was after 2 years of inaction on behalf of the UN, and it was despite evidence, being backed by evidence from the UN's weapons inspectors. As we know, that vote was lost. I did not back action, and I carry a sense of guilt because of the vote I carried at the time, because the vote I made at the time. There were members in this House, many of them on both sides of the House, who rose and argued that if we did not vote to take action, that would be perceived as a sense of weakness. That, hand in hand with the UN's intransigence, that Assad would strike again and would use chemical weapons against his own civilians, against his own children again in the future. And those members on both sides of the House in 2013 who rose and made that point were absolutely right. And we are here today debating after the same thing has happened again. Actually, after that vote, the first people to come out, the first country to come out and say they welcomed our vote not to bomb Syria were Russia, strangely enough. And I do carry that weight of guilt. What took place last week was a one-off strike, and it was necessary to attack and disable some of the chemical deposits and bases owned by Assad, and leave him in no doubt that the international community will never accept his breaking of that century-old accord, that crossing the red line to use chemical weapons again on his own civilians. The Prime Minister, along with the international community of France and America and our allies, will not. They have stood by the side this time of the civilians and the children of Syria. And recently, Mr. Speaker, until recently, my constituency was home to RAF Henlow and is still home with the intelligence base Chicksands. And my constituents are many former serving personnel and existing serving personnel, military personnel. By launching a one-off preemptive strike with no discussion or vote was a case of the Prime Minister putting first the safety of my constituents at the heart of her decision. Let none of us here be so arrogant to think that we know best and we know more and that we should always have the final say, because we have already been proven that we don't. We don't always get it right. And some would argue that when we voted to go to war with Iraq in 2003, we got it wrong then as well. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister was proposing regime change or to go to war or to enter into a sustained campaign of attack, then of course we would have a debate here. Of course we would expect the Prime Minister to bring that case to Parliament and maybe, yes, even have a vote. However, we weren't. And before we vote today, I would ask every single member in this House to imagine this, because this is not about a process. There is no substance to the motion that we will be voting on today. Let us imagine here, let us imagine here in this chamber that the children of Syria, with their eyes streaming and their blood-stained spittle, as my honourable right honourable friend has just said, are here stood in the chamber with us, that they are listening to us, that they are sat amongst us. How would they want us to vote? It's not about process. No, I won't. It's not about process. It's not about whether or not information is brought to the House of Commons. And I would just like to make this point again, which the honourable member for Grantham made. It's that how can we cast a vote when we don't have all the information? How can we make such an ill-informed vote as we have done in the past? And would the children of Syria want us to do that? I know what will happen next time I cast a substantive vote on an issue such as this. I will imagine the hand of one of those children in Syria slipping into mine and guiding me the right way into the right lobby.
Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be able to make a short contribution. In 1996, the US launched a cruise missile attack on Al-Shifa. They did so on the basis that it was a plant for VX, and it was on the back of the East African outrages, and also Sudan had not very long before managed to get rid of Osama bin Laden from within their territory. It later transpired that the Al-Shifa plant was a pharmaceutical plant, and that there was no evidence whatsoever that there was any improper use of chemicals in that plant. The Sudanese still refer to it on the number of occasions I've been to it. They've offered to show people, including the Americans, what the plant was. They've kept it as rubble. Now, I use that as an example of where things are got wrong. And intelligence is not sacrosanct. Now, I've never been a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee. I'm never likely to be. But it is right for this Parliament to hold the government to account. And there's nothing more important than when it holds the government to account on whether it's right to go to war. Now, it may well be that the Al-Shi, for example, is about the Americans and their lack of intelligence in this respect. It became known as Wag the Dog, of course, because, of course, it was more to do with President Clinton trying to offset some of his own problems at home. I can't say what the motive behind the President of the United States at the moment was, but again, there are sometimes ulterior motives why people launch conflict. Now, in our own case, we've got more recently both Afghanistan, where we were told that not a shot would be fired and it would be a straightforward invasion, and of course Libya, where we were told that it would be about regime change, but this would be about evolving. I'm not giving away because we're very short on time now, and it was about evolving a democratic structure. But more particularly, it's about Iraq. Now, I was around in the House at the time of Iraq, and I remember it wasn't about the government at that time willingly giving backbenchers a vote. We dragged it out of the government because there was so much opposition that they had to give a vote. And in a sense, backbenchers created that precedent. It's an important convention. It's important that we as a Parliament have a view. And that's one of the problems, that our constituents at the moment have been emailing us, stopping us in the street, saying, what's your view? Why haven't we heard what Parliament's got to say? And I heard the Right Honourable Gentleman from the Liberal Democrats make that point, and I totally agree with him. It is important that Parliament has a say, and Parliament can get it right, and Parliament can get it wrong. But dare I say, so can governments. And it's right that we exercise our democratic right as representatives elected here. I'm not giving way. A Nice War Powers Act, and remember at the moment this is just an SO24, and this would have to go through proper scrutiny, as the Honourable Gentleman over there made quite, for North East Somerset, made quite clear. It would have to go through all the processes, and he intimated there were other ways of doing this. But I believe very strongly that this debate should be had, because at the moment we are very unclear. The government has changed the convention. It should have come here for a debate, not questions, a debate and a vote. It chose not to do so. So at the moment we have a very unclear situation where we go back to Iraq, where a precedent was created, and now that precedent has been changed. So I merely say it is right and proper we have this debate today, and that we therefore begin to move towards clarity on where we are on what was previously a convention of the House which no longer exists, and it's about time Parliament had its view and was able to decide on whether that convention is right or wrong.
And Johnny Mercer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this debate today. I wanted to lay out my position very clearly. I think everybody knows what my position is, but I profoundly disagree with many members of this House when it comes to this War Powers Act, which in my view would be an act of calamitous insanity to bring down on our foreign policy and what we try to do. But I'm going to make it very clear as to why that is, and why I think the Prime Minister has done absolutely the right thing. And I would ask you to bear these remarks in context. I have done the other side of the veil. I have operated at the highest strategic possible level for this country on operations. And I must be honest with you that if we are to continue to have the freedom to manoeuvre and the opportunity to keep this country safe, we cannot enshrine these powers from the Prime Minister in a War Powers Act. Firstly, the practical reasons. Okay, when it comes to the intelligence, it is absolutely right that there is some aspects of intelligence in this country that will never be made public. Why? Because the way we gather them is a secret, and our opponents do not know how we gather them. We bring them out into the public domain, we expose that capability, and we make this country less safe simply so we can have a say in this House on foreign policy. And that is not right. The speed and the surprise of any minute I will not give away. I've heard a lot of the arguments in this House. The speed and the secrecy that we try and uphold in military operations cannot be curtailed by decision-making. Now, should Parliament have a say? Should Parliament have a debate? Should MPs be listened to? Are MPs important in this debate? Absolutely. But when it comes to defence of this nation and the freedoms and the privileges that we in this House live up to and enjoy every day, we cannot inhibit those people who fight for them retrospectively by bringing in a War Powers Act. This country has a role to play on the global stage, and think for a moment of the Americans and the French and how we look when they are asking us in the dead of night, in that last decision-making process, whether or not we will stand shoulder to shoulder with them in some of these highly contentious operations. Do we want our Prime Minister to actually have in the back of her mind, I've got to go to Parliament and I may lose a vote, so therefore I am not going to do the right thing for the country? Or do we want to empower her to do the right thing in the British national interest to keep this country safe? I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I listen to what he says. We all accept that the sources of intelligence should never be disclosed to the House of Commons, but surely these are essentially political and foreign policy judgments that are made in the end about whether to use force to defend the national interest. And these arguments could be applied to health, to education, lots of other areas. The concept that the gentleman in Whitehall knows best has never been allowed to overrule Parliament in any other area of policy, certainly not in modern times.
And I respect the Father of the House's position, but where there is a fundamental difference between intelligence around national security and policy on health or social security benefits or whatever it is. Look, I have seen... Yes, I will give way for the last time.
I'm just picking up, Speaker, if I may, on that last intervention made. How could this House have possibly taken a decision on the action that was being proposed unless we knew broadly the nature of the action, how limited it was going to be, and what was going to be targeted, giving exactly the information that would have been of use to the Syrian regime?
My honourable friend makes a very clear point, and I must say some of the contributions in this House absolutely lend weight as to why Parliament should not have a say in this. We have heard time and again the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence have stood up in this country and they have said this is a limited action, this is a one-time action, we are targeting chemical weapons, and yet question after question, is this part of a greater war? What are you going to do about Russia? She must have answered them 47 times, and the questions keep coming. And I'm afraid one of the most galling points in all this is how anybody in this House can take it upon themselves to accuse this Prime Minister, either personally or professionally, of being willing to commit UK service personnel into conflict at the result of the whim of anybody else that is not in line with British interests is offensive, is childish, is the place of student politics, and it is not acceptable. And I would say to those opposite, look, I respect all members of this House. I profoundly respect those who disagree with me. But my right honourable friend, I forget where he's gone, but my right honourable friend mentioned vanity, and everyone got upset about vanity, right? This is not a game. This is not a TV show where we get to go and make profound speeches, trying to make tactical decisions about military operations of which we know nothing about. This is not a game. And inaction while Syria burns is not acceptable, and it has been for too long in this country. Finally, I would gently say to my own Prime Minister, and I'll wrap it up here, is that we do have, and I do have sympathy with members opposite, we have to bring the British people with us. And it is a fundamental duty of every member of this House to go out there and advocate for this nation if we are going to take them to war. And we have to do that in a way that people are going to support it, that people are going to understand why they are being committed to war, and we can always do better on that, I feel, particularly since Iraq and having been to Afghanistan and fought what were very lonely conflicts, trying to motivate young people to do very dangerous things every single day that nobody in this country really knew about and sometimes felt didn't care about. So every member of my front bench and of this House has a duty to advocate in that regard. But finally, on Iraq, I was never here in 2003, but if we are going to persistently, for the next 20, 30 years, look at the foreign policy objectives of this nation of ours through the prism of Iraq and the profound mistakes that were made in that process, we will not be becoming the Britain that we all know we want to be. And it will inhibit our ability to project our interests into what we want to do. There were profound mistakes made in the decision-making process in Iraq. We have raked over it for generations. The great British people out there do not want us to do it for interminable length so that we never actually play a role in, this, in the world and become the global Britain that we all know we want to be. So it would just be a plea that on this we listen even more intently to the professionals. And if there is anybody who can go and find a security service professional in this country who thinks the War Powers Act is a good idea, I will vote for it tonight. But you will not find a single individual who works and has knowledge of the status of how security works in this country who is going to support this motion, and that is why I will not either.
Heidi Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This debate today about how we take decisions on UK military action is an important one. The decision of the Prime Minister to commit British service personnel to involvement in limited airstrikes against Syrian targets last week has generated strong feelings on both sides. I have mixed views on the rights and wrongs of that action, and I don't know how I would have voted should the decision have been presented to Parliament. But this debate is not about that. It's about the process by which decisions of this nature are taken and the right of the government, the executive, to retain flexibility to act without recourse to Parliament. I think the executive should have that right, and had I been in the Prime Minister's shoes last week, I think it is likely that I would have chosen a similar course. An erratic president in the White House upon whom you wish to exercise influence, a UN Security Council rendered powerless due to the Russian veto, a hung parliament, and the reuse of chemical weapons in a country which was supposed to have eradicated its stockpile 5 years ago. I don't have access to the intelligence that the Prime Minister does, but I recognise that the context in which she was acting could not have been more complex. This debate, though, is not about the specifics of the last week. It's about the nature of the decision-making process in future and whether we should constrain the hand of government. I'll give way.
I thank my friend for giving way. She's made some very strong points. I personally believe that the Prime Minister should have come here last week and we should have had that debate, and whatever the rights and wrongs of it were. But would she share my concerns that having a very, very fixed War Powers Act not only would be very difficult to achieve in debate because of the wide range of views around these issues as we've seen in this debate on this issue, but also because in the one example where it does exist, the United States, as far as I know, it's never been actually used to prosecute a president, and in fact many actions have been taken beyond the 60-day limit. So even in practice these things don't operate in the way that they are claimed to do so.
I have great sympathy with what my honourable friend has said. Much has been said in recent years about the Syria votes that happened in this place in 2013. Something that is often forgotten is that the two votes that took place on that night 5 years ago were about two different decision-making processes. One, the Labour motion, was a more rigorous process. The government motion was less defined. Had either of those motions passed, there would have been another vote, a substantive vote, on the question of military involvement the following week. That vote never happened because the then Prime Minister decided he couldn't risk it. I remember the build-up to that vote. I felt sick. I knew I was elected to this place to be part of these decisions, but the responsibility, even as a junior member of the opposition's whip's office at the time, weighed heavily upon me. The truth is, I spent 48 hours on Google, trying to locate reliable sources to educate myself when I felt I should have been studying it for 2 years and not 2 days. What factions were fighting whom and where? What was the objective? What did the responsibility to protect in international humanitarian law mean? And how could you judge the legitimacy of any action? I envied the moral certitude with which some colleagues spoke. It felt enormous, and it was. I don't regret the decisions I took that night. Had the outcome of the vote been different, it is likely that many thousands of people would still have died, as they have done in Syria since. Different weapons, different culpability. But nor do I regret the decision to vote for airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria in December 2015. In fact, I'm proud of that. Different proposals, different decisions. And I believe different circumstances will sometimes require different decision-making processes. If we are to change the way in which we make decisions about military action in this country, let's do it with cool heads. Let's not start the debate when it will only be seen through the prism of last week's action. Our attention this week should be on the children of Duma, not the consciences of Westminster MPs. We owe it to those children to come up with real solutions for their country that has been torn to shreds. Internal retrospection on our part, however well-meaning, won't help them.
Sir Edward Lee.
I believe that the government's argument about the legality of last week's action is technically correct. The use of military force is part of the royal prerogative. Her Majesty invests her government with that power. The Queen is Commander-in-Chief. This is an important power. It's vital to the effectiveness of our armed forces. So I have no constitutional disagreement with what the government has done. However, there is a word of warning here. As Chesterton put it, to have a right to do a thing is not at all the same as to be right in doing it. And there is a risk here and a moral to be learned. I do commend the Prime Minister for the limited scope of the intervention. And whilst it is true that the government can intervene technically and militarily without consulting Parliament, I believe that this power should be used on as few occasions, if at all. And this is where I echo what my right honourable friend, the Father of the House, has said. I don't accept, by the way, that we need a War Powers Act because it would be justiciable. I don't believe in referring everything to the United Nations when, as my honourable friend for Beaconsfield said today, one power has a permanent right of veto. But I think that we should proclaim this afternoon the right of Parliament to debate and vote on military action in the future, unless, as was probably the case here, there is an urgent humanitarian case to be made. Now, I want to say a word about some of the problems that we face in the Middle East. The problem we face in the Middle East is that we are seen to be party pre in this conflict, that we are seen by many people not to be primarily concerned with humanitarian concern for the people of Duma, but actually we are engaged in a proxy war. That is not fair. I know that is not a fair point of view, but unfortunately, in the past, we have proclaimed our desire to replace the Assad regime. The conflict began in 2011. Assad is still president of the Syrian Arab Republic. And the idea that the Americans achieved a great deal by backing the Free Syrian Army, a kind of Lib Dems with gardens, has proved a complete and total fantasy, including...
Incoming fire!
Mr. Speaker, I do thank you for allowing me to intervene because I was late for this debate and I apologise. I cannot resist rising to that challenge. would the right honourable member agree with me that the line of questioning we've heard from constituents about, is Parliament going to be recalled? Are you going to have a vote on it? In fact, in my answering and saying I don't know led to puzzlement and confusion, and that in itself, I would suggest to the right honourable member, is corrosive to the democratic confidence of the electorate in their elected members and what they do here in this place. Mr. Speaker.
Well, I have considerable sympathy with the argument of the honourable gentleman, as I've just said, that generally I've agreed with the Father of the House that generally Parliament should have its say before action is taken. Now, the reason why I believe that there is so much opposition to what we're doing in the Middle East is I don't think Western governments from the beginning have really been cognizant of the sheer complexity of the situation. The Americans are against Assad and the Russians and they are for the Kurds, many of whom are against Assad. But the Americans are allied to the Turks, who are against the American-backed Turks. And the Turks will do anything to stop the Kurds, even though both are friends of the Americans. This shows the sheer complexity of the situation. And I have to quote from the patriarchs of the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and the Melkite Catholic Church. They are based in Syria, and they rely on protection and therefore continual survival on the Assad regime. They say, and this can be dismissed, that they are subject to pressure from the regime, but they have said this week, and their Beatitudes say, it causes us great pain that this assault comes from powerful countries to which Syria does not cause any harm in any way. These are Christian leaders speaking in Syria. And I think that we should be very, very careful. Of course. Yeah.
Did any of those Christian leaders in Syria comment on the atrocities vested on the innocent children that we've seen in the last week?
I have just said that these Christian leaders are under great pressure from the Assad regime to, as it were, toe the party line. But the fact is that their responsibility is to protect their own communities, which are under unprecedented pressure. And I do think that we have to take some account of the pressure on Christian communities. Now, the all-party group to the Vatican was in Rome last week, and we had a meeting on persecuted Christians in Syria. We met with every single expert from the refugee services, from all over the world, who looks at this issue. And they all told us that bombing was a very dangerous thing to do in terms of opinion in the Middle East and in terms of the pressure from Muslims on the remaining Christian communities. And I was very powerfully struck by the representative of the Catholic Church in Pakistan, who said that our communities in Pakistan will now get it even more in the neck because Muslims, so many Muslims, unfairly do not differentiate between Russian bombs and American bombs and French bombs and British bombs. They say that the misery in Syria has been caused by foreign powers, by foreign Christian powers raining bombs on their communities. Now, this may be an unfair point of view, but it is a generally held point of view in the Middle East. And therefore, I want to make this point, which has not been made by anybody else in this debate so far. I accept the government was right to act. I accept that it has the powers under the royal prerogative to act. But I do not believe that anymore we should pursue our objective of trying to change the Assad regime. And then if we do act for humanitarian reasons, if we do intervene to deter a possible chemical attack, we will have so much more credibility in the Middle East, because we will not be seen to be taking sides. So that I believe, is the way forward.
Will my honourable friend give
well, unfortunately, I can't give way because I'm running out of time. I've agreed with my honourable friend for Beaconsfield, but I hope that when we debate these things in future, we will remember that we will avoid all hypocrisy. The fact is that as much as we detest Assad, as much as he is a dictator, we as Christians, none of us would want to live in an area outside Assad control in Syria because he would protect us. It's a difficult thing to say in Parliament. Not everybody will agree with it, but I have to say what I have to say.
Extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman. Mr. Alex Norris.
Mr. Speaker, in 2011, this House was promised that the government would enshrine in law for the future the necessity of consulting Parliament on military action. And this would have completed a painful journey from prior to the Iraq campaign, where it took the threat of a wildcat Parliament in Church House to drag the government to this place to vote on that matter, and would have seen Parliament play a formal and in statute role in the process of war and of action overseas. Now, over 5 years' worth of discussion took place about how this might happen before a future Secretary of State came along and abandoned these plans because he believed that they would constrain operational flexibility. But whilst those plans have been abandoned, Mr. Speaker, what we've seen this week is that this discussion is far from over. And if we all look at our mailbags from the last few days, we will see that our constituents expect us to play a role in this process. They expect to hold us accountable for our actions, and I want that. It would be exceptionally difficult, of course. I won't for the minute. I'm going to make a little bit of progress. But we were sent here to tackle the exceptionally difficult. In 2013, Parliament debated military action. That's been played out lots over the last few hours, and MPs were given their opportunity to have their say, for better or for worse, to cast their votes and have their say on behalf of their constituents and to be held accountable for it. And it seemed like at this point a good convention had been established, and that's the way that things would be here. I'll give way.
Thank you. On that point, although there is a convention, in the United States there is a law, the US War Powers Resolution, which requires the President to notify Congress to justify within 48 hours sending use military forces into foreign nations equipped for combat. Isn't that exactly the situation we were faced with last week?
Yeah, I share that. My honourable friend from Leeds North West and I share a real passion for matters all-American, Mr. Speaker, not just basketball and American football in the cases, but also the American Constitution, and he highlights it very well here. I give way.
Would the honourable gentleman be good enough, in view of the fact that he is invoking statute as the means to achieve his objectives, that effectively this means surrendering national decisions of the most effectively vital importance to the United Kingdom to the courts to decide, because that is where this will lead.
That's right, Bill.
The honourable gentleman hasn't given me the chance to make my case. What I'm arguing for is for a formalised, codified role for this place, so that we're not in the situation that we were in last week, where for as many tweets as there were about whether we should be acting at all in this instance, there was one saying, should Parliament be recalled? We shouldn't be in that fudge at a time when we're making such important decisions. Now, we're not asking to constrain operational flexibility. Of course we're not. I don't believe that in this place I and all of us collectively should be setting the strategy for a campaign. But we should have the opportunity to make sure that there is a strategy for the campaign and have the chance to ask those questions. Now, I'll give way.
This was not about a campaign. In this instance, this is about, effectively, a surgical strike. And does the honourable member not recognise that he would be constraining the flexibility of the Prime Minister if there was a question of timing and that she would be obliged to come to this House first? That could seriously impede any operational activity.
And of course, I'm not arguing for that. We could weave into anything. If there was a clear and immediate national interest to act, then of course we could weave that into statute. But I'm getting to that point, which the honourable gentleman will be very glad to hear, because I want to draw on the work of the previous Political and Constitutional Reform Committee. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know you've got a keen eye for detail and strong powers of recall, so you'll remember that it was my predecessor that chaired that committee. Now, a keen interest in constitutional reform and all these sorts of matters does not pass down through the generations, I'm afraid, of Nottingham North parliamentarians, or if it does, it has skipped me. Nevertheless, these are excellent documents. I would draw honourable gentlemen and ladies to these documents as a manual for how we might have such statute in our law. And it offers comprehensive insight, offers the hurdles we would face, including the ones regarding the courts, and the solutions that we have at our disposal. The solutions are there, and this can be done if there is will to do it. Now, the previous Prime Minister said that consulting Parliament regarding military action was a good convention. Now, clearly that convention, and I think this week has shown this, leaves too much room for debate and is, as the Leader of the Opposition said, is broken. So now is the time to settle this, so one way for the other, in statute, what role we have, even if that role, frankly, was to play no role at all. I think it ought to be written down. That's why I believe we need a War Powers Act. Because last week, as I say, what we had was a fudge. It will not do that whilst we are talking about really significant incidents across the globe, we're also having a conversation about whether or not we should, we're doing a hokey-cokey, are we coming to London, are we not, to talk about these matters. I don't believe that will do. So if the government does believe, and the Prime Minister did say this in her remarks, that the Convention still stands, so she believes that Parliament ought to have a role in military action, well, now is the time to make good on that, and that through legislation we'll show once and for all what Parliament does and doesn't do, and how, in the popular words of the day, we have taken back control for this Parliament. Thank you.
Mr. Crispin-Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In making my contribution towards the end of this debate, I want to reflect particularly on the speeches that were made at the beginning from this side, where my honourable friends for Harwich and North Essex, Grantham and Stamford and North East Somerset brought us back to the fundamentals of parliamentary accountability. Parliament controls the laws, supply and confidence over the executive, and through those mechanisms, as my honourable friend for North East Somerset made clear, we do have the ability to hold the government firmly to account. The history of the Armed Forces Act and, of course, underneath that, the evolution of convention about governments coming to Parliament and our flexible constitution has brought us to the place now where we have the expected accountability of governments coming to Parliament in order to seek authorisation for specific military actions. But that is merely convention. And if we examine the occasions on which the government has come to this House to seek parliamentary authority to reinforce its own prerogative powers, it has been because of the political situation that it's felt and its own assessment of what it needs in order to get to reinforce its own authority. In 2003, the then Labour government and Tony Blair had a minority of support from its own backbenchers for the proposed action in Iraq. And I think that then made it necessary for the then government to come here to seek a parliamentary authority to reinforce its own political position. But in terms of that debate and the authorisation that Parliament gave to the government of the day, I sat there on the opposition benches, listening to the Prime Minister make his argument. We're thinking this was a bizarre set of affairs. My former colleagues in the armed forces were on the start line. They were in the final stages of their battle procedure before they conducted the invasion of Iraq, where the British armed forces were responsible for about a third of the front line of that invasion with our American allies. And it struck me as quite extraordinary that we were then having a two-day debate in Parliament that was ending at about 10 o'clock or midnight, about 6 hours before that operation was due to commence, where Parliament was going to say yes or no on that operation. On those grounds alone, I thought it would be irresponsible to my former colleagues for us to turn around and suddenly say, no, you've got to stop, guys, because we have decided that it's the wrong thing to do. As we now know from history, it probably would have been better had we said no, but we should have been saying no infinitely earlier than the immediate military commencement of a major strategic operation like that. We know that Tony Blair gave his commitment to President Bush in April 2002. We know that our military were being instructed to make plans for the invasion of Iraq and be part of that operation from the summer of 2002. And so this is where Parliament and the conventions we appear to have established collide with military and operational reality. And I am in total agreement with my honourable friend for Plymouth Moor View about the circumstances under which one seeks a parliamentary approval for operations of the kind that we saw last week. He and I jointly authored a pamphlet which every colleague in the House received in July last year on how Britain should respond to chemical weapons attacks in Syria. Our answer to the parliamentary problem that the government might have received would have been some kind of pre-authorisation motion. to have had a debate about the kinds of circumstance in which the government found itself last week, and then to have been able to act within authority that had been given by Parliament for the kind of action contained, and indeed that parliamentary approval itself might have acted as a form of deterrent. The Syrian government then knowing that they were going to face action which would involve the British armed forces in response to the kind of situation which the Americans had already reacted to before. But, Mr. Speaker, in all of this we have a development of convention about the government coming here. I do not think a War Powers Act is the appropriate answer. As my honourable friends have made clear, this House does control the essential elements of control over the executive.
To the honourable gentleman. I'll call the honourable gentleman on condition that he sits down at 3:53, start thereof, no later. Is that agreed? Agreed. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I've never disagreed with you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say that this whole thing to the public, of course, will look weird after we've had a weekend of members of Parliament following events on their TV screens, debating in TV studios, while this chamber sits completely vacant. No one can deny that this has been an issue of national importance, and yet there has been not, or barely rather, a finger of protest lifted by backbenchers on the government side of the House. Worse, Mr. Speaker, we've had the grotesque sight of members of Parliament willing to sign away their agency to an executive that wishes to grab more power. In fact, it was the honourable gentleman from Plymouth Moorview who said that it was not for members of Parliament to inhibit the Prime Minister. That's exactly the job of members of Parliament. It has been since around 1688. Yesterday, another extraordinary thing was put forward by a Conservative Member of Parliament. He actually thanked the Prime Minister for not bothering to ask him to make a decision in this debate. Is this place really filled with people who think such foolish things? What kind of supine Member of Parliament would think such a thing in the face of this executive? And as the UN Security Council becomes a broken instrument more and more every day, the time is for more democratic accountability, not less democratic accountability. And to those saying we couldn't have voted without the full picture, well, let's go back to 2015, when they were falling over each other to heap praise on the then Prime Minister for his decisive actions in calling a vote. I don't recall them then saying they didn't have the full picture and they couldn't possibly pick or take part in a debate. This has been a smokescreen used by Conservative members of Parliament, willing to sign over the agency that the public invests in them, to hold this government accountable, to make sure that it doesn't keep rolling back the powers of this Parliament, and they ought to be ashamed of it.
Thank you. The debate will be concluded by the member who secured it, the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the 2 minutes I've got available to me, I just want to say this. This is a debate about the rights of Parliament and the role of Parliament. Many members have made very good contributions to this debate. I was very impressed with the contribution by the member for North East Somerset, who took us back to 1688, and he's right about the Bill of Rights, but I just gently say to him, I think democracy can go forward even from 1688 to a slightly more modern time. And he's right that we have an unwritten constitution, which is why I believe we do indeed need an act which would require governments to seek the approval of Parliament before undertaking major military actions or campaigns. I was fascinated by the speech from the honourable member for Newbury. I'm not quite sure why he brought my mother into the debate, but I'm sure she'd be very proud to have been mentioned in the debate. And I'm grateful to the member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber for his support for the principle of two things. One is that Parliament could and should have been recalled last week and wasn't. And secondly, that Parliament should have the right to decide on major policy issues and be able to hold the government to account. The 2011 doctrine laid down what the process should be. This government is trying to roll back from the 2011 doctrine, and I think this, Mr. Speaker, is a time for Parliament and democracy to assert itself on the most serious issues we ever face as members of Parliament, and that is whether to send people into war or not, or what the strategy of the government is. And so I invite my colleagues to vote against the substantive motion today, to express our dissatisfaction with the government's response and assert the rights of Parliament.
I beg to move that the question be now put.
Please that the question be now put. As many as out of opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. The question is that this House has considered Parliament's rights in relation to the approval of military action by British forces overseas. As many as other opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Division! Clear the lobby! Order. The question is as on the order paper. In fact, in view of the solemnity of this matter, I will just repeat it. The question is that this House has considered Parliament's rights in relation to the approval of military action by British forces overseas. As many as are that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. Tellers for the ayes, Mims Davis and Kelly Tolhurst. Tellers for the noes, Jeff Smith and Vicky Foxcroft.